Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the lace-lined corridors of the world's most exclusive, extravagant and, to be perfectly blunt, genetically terrifying club, European royalty. You've probably heard about their castles and jewels, maybe even the occasional scandal involving a horse, but tonight? Tonight we're diving into what no one really wants to talk about, the inbreeding. And not the mild, my third cousin's kinda cute variety. We're talking uncle-niece marriages, double cousins, and bloodlines looped so tightly they practically strangled themselves. You probably won't survive this if you were born into it, and honestly most of them didn't either. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I know you're not here for sunshine and fairy tales. This is more velvet curtains and family trees that resemble tangled headphone wires. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story starts not with one woman, but with a tradition, an idea really, that power could be preserved through blood, literal blood. The purer, the better, which in royal speak meant marrying your cousin, and then your other cousin, and then your cousin's daughter, who also happened to be your niece. Because the fewer people you let into the pool, the more control you had over the empire. But no one talked about what that pool started to look like after a few generations. It got murky, stagnant, and deep in those waters, the royal women floated, dutiful, decorated, and often doomed. Take a moment to imagine what it's like to be born into this. You're a princess, maybe in Spain, Austria, or Bavaria. You don't choose your name, your clothes, or your husband, and he might be your uncle. From the moment you take your first breath, you're not seen as a child, you're an asset. Your education might include embroidery, court etiquette, and how to produce a male heir before your bones start to ache at age 25. You're expected to look radiant while silently carrying the weight of generations of genetic misfires. It's easy to forget that these women weren't just symbols. They were people. Girls. Many of them were terrified, isolated, shuttled from one icy palace to another like prized livestock. But unlike livestock, they weren't bred for resilience, they were bred for status, which is why some of them didn't even make it past their teens. And the ones who did often bore the physical signs of what centuries of closed-loop reproduction can do: misshapen jaws, sunken chests, fused spines, haemophilia, epilepsy, infertility. Not to mention the mental health toll, depression, hallucinations, paranoia, and yet portraits painted them as serene, regal, untouched. Let's not forget the awkward family gatherings, because everyone at court was related, not just distantly, like, that's my second cousin and also my brother-in-law and maybe my step-grandfather kind of relate. The Habsburgs were the worst offenders. A royal family so devoted to preserving their bloodline that they repeated the same names, faces and genes for over 200 years. Imagine a dynasty so tangled that a single woman could be descended from the same four grandparents on both sides. That's not just family pride, that's genetic Russian roulette. Now imagine being one of those women. You're born into a palace where silence echoes and marble floors chill your bones. Your meals are served on gold plates, but the people around you speak in riddles and expectations. You're constantly watched. Your fertility tracked like a royal stock ticker. You might marry your first cousin because a treaty demands it, and then you're shipped to a foreign land where you speak none of the language but are expected to smile through childbirth after childbirth, many of which end in death. Still, the illusion had to be maintained, so painters would erase any signs of weakness. Portraits were carefully curated, soft lighting, delicate gowns, skin like porcelain, but behind those images were women in agony. Take Maria Anna of Spain, for example. We'll get to her in more detail later, but spoiler, she married her own uncle and suffered from such intense jaw deformities that chewing food was physically painful. But in paintings, she's serene, almost holy, because royalty wasn't about humanity, it was about legacy. Here's the twist most history classes skip. These women weren't just victims of bad science, they were often complicit, not because they were evil or cruel, but because they didn't know any better. They were told it was noble to marry within the bloodline, that it was their divine duty. Some believed it was the only way to keep their family's influence intact, but others broke, quietly or spectacularly. Madness often followed. So did death, and in rare cases, rebellion. There's a debate among historians about just how much of this was genetic and how much was environmental. Did mental illness come from the inbreeding? Or from the crushing pressure of palace life? Isolation, grief, boredom, the constant fear of being replaced by a younger, more fertile relative, all of it compounded. But let's be real, when your parents are cousins, and your grandparents were too, odds are stacked high that your brain chemistry isn't going to be textbook. We'll follow the lives of 25 women across several centuries, each with her own tragic and sometimes bizarre legacy. Some were queens, some never left the nursery. All of them were tied by a common thread, the belief that power was worth more than health, happiness, or humanity. So as we begin our descent into the velvet-wrapped madness of royal womanhood, just know you won't find fairy tales here. No glass slippers, only glass bones, fragile minds, and dynasties that mistook blood purity for divine right. And when we zoom in, you'll start to see it wasn't just biology that failed these women, it was the entire system that kept them gilded, isolated, and slowly unravelling. You first see her in a portrait, dark eyes, narrow lips, and an expression you can't quite read. It's not joy, not sadness either, just a kind of detachment. This is Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Moor. But of course the term mad in royal chronicles often does a lot of heavy lifting. What they don't tell you is how much of her supposed madness was inherited, how much was triggered, and how much was convenient for the men around her. You're born into this story in 1479, the daughter of Isabella Fiestern of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. Yes, that Isabella and Ferdinand. The Catholic monarchs. You're the third child, so no one expects you to inherit much. But then fate shuffles the royal deck. Your older brother dies. Your sister, the heir, also dies. Suddenly, it's your name carved into destiny, and with that comes pressure. Pressure that no one, not even someone with solid genetics, could handle, let alone someone whose family tree is beginning to sag under its own weight. Joanna was intensely intelligent, fluent in multiple languages, gifted in music and theology, not exactly what you'd expect from someone later locked away in a convent for half her life. But here's where the Habsburgs enter the chat. At 16, she's married off to Philip the Handsome, Philip of Burgundy. Now, this guy had a jawline that could start wars, and he knew it. He was charming, fashionable, and dangerously flirtatious. Joanna fell for him hard. The kind of obsessive love that festers more than it blooms. And here's where things start to get weird. Joanna becomes increasingly unstable. Violent outbursts, episodes of screaming, refusal to eat. She suspects Philip of cheating, and let's be real, he probably was. But instead of addressing the situation like, a person, the royal court decides she must be going insane, because emotional intensity in a woman? Always a red flag in royal circles. Her behaviour becomes harder to hide though. She once allegedly flew into such a rage that she assaulted one of Philip's mistresses. Later, when he died suddenly, likely from typhoid, Joanna refused to bury the body for weeks. She'd open the casket to ensure he wasn't being stolen. She'd sleep beside it, travel with it. The story is gothic, tragic, and, if you ask some scholars, possibly exaggerated. There's an open debate here, and it's worth pausing to consider. Was Joanna clinically schizophrenic, as some historians suggest? Or was she reacting to a life of betrayal, isolation, and manipulation, all compounded by the pressures of ruling and the genetic predisposition toward mental illness? She came from a lineage not just of powerful monarchs, but of tightly intermarried blood. Isabella and Ferdinand were second cousins, and several generations of noble intermarriage preceded them. It's not a far leap to suggest Joanna's madness may have had deep roots in both nature and nurture. Here's a more chilling thought. Maybe Joanna wasn't insane at all. Maybe she was just inconvenient. Because once Philip was dead, her father, Ferdinand, had no intention of letting his daughter rule independently. And after Ferdinand died, her son, Charles, future Holy Roman Emperor, also had zero interest in sharing power. So what do they owe? Lock her away. For decades. She lives in Tordesillas, a gloomy palace turned prison, isolated from her children, her court, the world. Visitors report she refused to bathe, lived in darkness, spoke to no one. But then again, who wouldn't break a little under those conditions? What's rarely mentioned is how Joanna's genetics were passed down. Her children included Charles V, the emperor who would later expand the Habsburg dynasty to horrifyingly inbred levels. So in a sense, Joanna wasn't just a broken link in the chain, she was a forge. Her blood became the foundation of a new generation of rulers whose faces would grow stranger, whose jaws would jut farther, whose minds would fracture more easily. And the court, the advisors, priests and physicians of the time, they didn't help. Royal medicine in the 16th century was a fascinating combination of leeches, prayers, and theories about humours. Mental illness wasn't understood, it was feared. So when a queen began acting strangely, whether from psychosis or heartbreak, the best they could offer was confinement and silence. A woman suffering, especially a royal one, was often treated as scandal rather than illness. Still, if you walked the halls of Tordesillas during Joanna's final years, you might hear whispers, servants claiming she talked to shadows, that she refused communion, that she saw Philip's ghost. But again, maybe it wasn't ghosts she saw. Maybe it was what had been stolen from her. A crown, a husband, her children, her voice, all taken under the guise of protection. The tragedy of Joanna isn't just that she may have gone mad, it's that we'll never truly know if she had to. She was born into a role that crushed individuality and punished deviation. She loved too much, trusted too little. And when she started slipping, the men around her pushed instead of reaching out. And here's a fringe fact for your dreams tonight. There's a rumour that Joanna's coffin still exists somewhere beneath the ruins of Tordesillas. Untouched, guarded, her body perfectly preserved. It probably isn't true, but it says something that people want to believe it, that she's still there, waiting. Maybe for someone to finally say she wasn't crazy, just cursed by blood and born in the wrong century. So Joanna fades into legend, the first in our long procession of inbred women whose lives weren't fairy tales but cautionary ones. And the worst part? She's not even the most tragic. Not by a long shot. You're in Lisbon now, the air thick with the perfume of citrus trees and the salt of the Atlantic. Everything smells like age and empire, like power held too tightly. Inside the stone walls of the Royal Alcazar, a child named Maria of Portugal is being groomed. Groomed in the oldest and most uncomfortable sense of the word. She's born in 1527, the only daughter of King John III of Portugal and his queen Catherine of Austria. That name should already give you pause. Austria. Yes, that Austria. The Habsburgs have crossed borders again. And here's where your eyebrows go up. Maria's parents, first cousins. Her grandparents, also cousins. Her great-grandparents, uncle-niece. This isn't just a few branches of the family tree kissing. It's one long spiralling branch twisting into itself like a snake trying to eat its own tail. And Maria, she's the result. Beautiful, yes, in the way portraits from the time often flatter. But behind the soft eyes and delicate lace, things aren't quite right. She's raised to be obedient, religious, and politically useful. That's all. Her education is rigid but narrow. Theology, languages, music. Not because anyone expects her to use these things, but because it makes her marriage resume look better. A good Habsburg girl had to be pious, fertile, and willing to be traded like a silk bolt across the continent. And guess what? That's exactly what happens. At 18, Maria is married off to Philip II of Spain, her first cousin. Again. Yes, again. The same Philip who would go on to marry Mary I of England and then his own niece. But at this point it's just him and Maria. Their marriage is one of political convenience meant to solidify the Iberian powers under a single Catholic banner. Love? Compatibility? Those aren't even on the table. From the start, Maria's health is fragile. She's constantly ill, and there's a vague, eerie frailty about her. She suffers several miscarriages and stillbirths before finally producing a son, also named Philip, because of course. But every pregnancy seems to chip away at her. The royal doctors try everything, herbal potions, bleeding, even ritual prayers, but nothing sticks. Eventually she withdraws from court life entirely, spending long hours in prayer or complete silence. Philip, being Philip, quickly loses interest and starts focusing on affairs of state and, well, other women. Here's the haunting part. Maria dies young, at just 26. The official cause is listed as uterine complications, which is royal code for we don't know and we're not looking. But behind the curtain, many believe she was simply too inbred to survive childbirth repeatedly. Her body couldn't handle it. Her immune system was a paper wall, her bones were weak. And her mental state, not exactly well documented, but there are hints of depression, intense mood swings, and social withdrawal in the few letters she left behind. Now, scholars still debate just how much inbreeding affected Maria directly. Some say she was merely a tragic figure caught in a brutal system. Others argue that by the time she was born, the genetic defects were already being whispered about in royal nurseries. You couldn't look at her lineage without seeing duplication. The same names, same facial features, same diseases cropping up over and over, like a curse that no one dared name aloud. Here's the fringe twist. Maria's son, Philip III of Spain, would later marry his own cousin and give birth to the infamous Philip IV, who in turn married his niece. The spiral didn't stop with Maria, it deepened. So in a way, her body became the bridge between two generations of escalating genetic collapse. And still, no one changed course. Because the alternative, marrying outside the bloodline, was considered far worse than a little haemophilia or the occasional malformed jaw, let's also not ignore the cultural coffin she was sealed into. The Portuguese court, like most Iberian courts of the time, was obsessed with ritual purity, not just religious, but genetic. It wasn't enough to be noble. You had to be purely noble, which meant no foreign blood, no peasant ancestry, no risk of scandal, which also meant you kept marrying the same 5 people over and over, even when it started to show in the children. Maria's short life is rarely studied in detail, overshadowed by the larger, louder figures around her, her husband, her father, her son. But if you look closely, she's a perfect early example of what the inbreeding experiment would cost. She played her part, said her prayers, bore her heir, and then she disappeared into the stone vaults of time, her legacy reduced to a footnote in dynastic charts. No rebellion, no letters from exile, just silence. And yet even in that silence something lingers. Maybe it's in the descriptions of her funeral, how the Spanish court wept more out of duty than grief, or in the cold efficiency with which Philip moved on, politically and romantically. Maybe it's the portrait of her that still hangs in Madrid, those wide, dark eyes gazing off into nothing. You can almost see it there, the heaviness behind her gaze, as if she knew, as if she understood that she wasn't a person in her own story, just another loop in the bloodline, another pawn in a game she never had a chance to win. And here's a quiet horror to chew on before sleep. Maria's coffin was reportedly opened centuries later during a royal crypt renovation. Her body, fragile even in death, had deteriorated rapidly. One account claimed her bones were so brittle, they crumbled at the touch. It might be legend, or it might be exactly the kind of tragic poetry her life demands. So you close the heavy doors on Maria of Portugal. One more woman born into the slow burn of royal extinction. One more link in a chain no one dared break. And tomorrow, the next bride arrives. It's a foggy morning in Brussels, the sky hanging low like a velvet curtain, and somewhere inside a marble-clad palace, Margaret of Austria is dressing in silence. Every button, every pin in her hair, every fold in her gown is perfectly placed. Because imperfection isn't an option. Not when you're born into the most scrutinised gene pool in Europe. Not when your face is a diplomatic statement and your spine has been trained to hold centuries of expectation. Margaret is a Habsburg, after all, and that means your private griefs are swallowed in public grace. She's born in 1584, the daughter of Charles II of Austria and Maria Anna of Bavaria. You already know what that means. More cousin marriage, more bloodlines doubled over themselves like a crumpled napkin. By this point in the Habsburg family, there are so many overlapping ancestors that the family tree looks more like a family pretzel. And Margaret? She inherits all the consequences, tucked neatly behind a calm, obedient smile. Her childhood is cloistered and cold. Education is rigid. Religious instruction, Latin, and of course courtly manners. She learns early on that the less she speaks, the more people like her. Her piety becomes her shield. She fasts, prays, punishes her body for sins she's too young to commit. It isn't just personal devotion, it's the expectation. Royal women are supposed to be holy, silent, and pale. She checks every box. At 25, she's married off to Philip III of Spain, her first cousin. By now, your eye probably twitches every time you hear that. But yes, another cousin marriage. Because in the twisted logic of Habsburg power politics, no one outside the family was ever good enough. The marriage is arranged like a military alliance, cold and calculated. There's a huge, glittering wedding, trumpets and incense, but underneath it all, you get the sense that Margaret already knows what she's in for. Philip is, fine. Not cruel, but passive. He lets others rule in his name, and Margaret? Margaret becomes the quiet spine of the Spanish court. She gives birth to 8 children in just over a decade. Some survive, some don't. Each pregnancy leaves her weaker, thinner, paler. The royal doctors don't understand why she faints so often, or why her teeth fall out, or why she seems to shiver even in warm rooms. But you do. You know the signs now. It's the slow erosion of a body carrying too many centuries of shared DNA. Her health collapses by degrees, the way cliffs crumble, not all at once, but with small permanent losses. Still, Margaret is beloved at court, and not for her wit or charm, but for her submission. She never challenges her husband, never complains about the miscarriages or the pain, never rebels. Her one act of resistance is subtle and soft. She refuses to wear bright colours, always in black or deep blue, like she's perpetually in mourning for a life she never chose. And maybe she is. There's one strange habit she develops later in life. During moments of extreme stress, she begins to whisper prayers under her breath, constantly, even in conversation. People at court begin to joke about it, the queen who talks to God but never hears back. But if they had her headaches, her fatigue, the feeling of being hollowed out from the inside, maybe they'd whisper too. Now here's the odd historical footnote. Margaret and Philip are both so closely related that their children, particularly their son Philip IV, show even more dramatic signs of inbreeding. That son would go on to marry his own niece, and the line would spiral even deeper into genetic collapse. But Margaret doesn't live to see it. She dies at just 33, after a final brutal labour leaves her bleeding and feverish. The official reports call it a divine calling, Radasio, which is a flowery way of saying she died doing what royal women were expected to do, quietly and in service of a name. Modern scholars still debate Margaret's mental health. Was her silence a choice, a survival mechanism? Or was it the result of something deeper? Clinical depression, exhaustion, or even neurological symptoms from vitamin deficiencies common in royal diets? It's hard to say. Records from that time speak of her as gentle and modest, but these were often euphemisms for emotionally vacant. And who wouldn't be after spending a lifetime being traded like a treaty? And here's your fringe fact of the night. Margaret had a personal confessor who reportedly kept a book cataloguing her every sin, including excessive weeping and unseemly silence. Let that sink in. In a world where you're married to your cousin and birthing child after child into a dying dynasty, it's crying and being too quiet that gets noted as sinful. The absurdity is almost poetic. Her body is buried with pomp and incense, slipped into the vast royal crypt beneath El Escorial, a necropolis for kings, queens, and the doomed children they left behind. No inscription, no epitaph, just a name among names. But if you believe in energy, in the kind of residual sorrow that clings to stone, then Margaret is still there, whispering her prayers into the darkness, long after the incense has faded. So now you've met another silent queen, another cousin bride, another woman whose name was more important than her health. And as we move forward, the faces will start to blur. You'll see the same sunken cheeks, the same tired eyes, the same sadness wrapped in silk. But for now, we leave Margaret as we found her, dressed in black, head bowed, saying nothing at all. The scent of incense clings to the stones of the Spanish royal chapel. There's gold everywhere, on the altar, on the robes, in the teeth of the priest. The year is 1474, and you're standing in the coronation chamber of Queen Isabella of Castile, the woman who will become one half of the most powerful royal pairing in early modern Europe. She's young, composed, and already armed, with a chilling certainty. She is doing God's work, and that means no compromise, not with enemies, not with peasants, and certainly not with her own bloodline. Isabella is the start of something. The spark that ignites a continent-wide obsession with control through genetics. She's the monarch who helps unite Spain through marriage, war, and a frankly terrifying level of faith-based confidence. And here's where your stomach should already clench a little, because this story is not about conquest or colonization, although, yes, there's plenty of that. This is about what she set into motion for her descendants, particularly the women who would come after her, the great creaking legacy of royal bloodlines, curated like a museum exhibit, until they began to rot from the inside. She marries Ferdinand of Aragon, second cousin of course, because dynastic unity was more important than genetic variation. Together they launch a reign of iron. The Reconquista, the expulsion of the Jews and Moors, the creation of the Spanish Inquisition, and the sponsorship of a certain Christopher Columbus. But all of that power, all of that empire building came with a cost, because it meant the royal house had to stay united, and the only way to do that was to start keeping things in the family. Their daughter is Joanna the Mad. You've already met her, remember? The one who slept next to her husband's corpse. That wasn't a fluke. That was the first clear warning shot fired by the bloodline. But Isabella doesn't see it. She just prays harder, doubles down on piety, and arranges more cousin marriages. Because from her perspective, this isn't a genetic bottleneck, it's divine will. Isabella's belief in royal purity seeps into everything. Her surviving daughters are married off to other European dynasties, most notably the Habsburgs. Her grandchildren include Charles V, who rules over an empire where the sun never sets and whose family tree doubles back on itself like a labyrinth. Isabella's legacy is not just empire, it's the foundation of an interbreeding project that would span generations and continents. The irony is rich and bitter. For all her devotion, all her religious fervour, Isabella's decisions result in the physical and mental decay of the very dynasty she was trying to preserve. But no one could tell her that. Not her confessors, not her doctors, not even her ghostwriters, who filled endless pages with tales of her virtue and holiness. Isabella believed she was chosen by God. And when you believe that, you don't question whether marrying your daughter to your nephew is going to cause problems 3 generations down the line. And she wasn't just revered, she was feared. Isabella ruled with such cold authority that even her own children walked on eggshells. You didn't disappoint her, you didn't disobey, and if you cried, you did it quietly behind closed doors where no one could see the cracks. That kind of pressure calcifies inside a family. It becomes tradition. And for the royal women who followed her, many of them her own blood, this expectation to be perfect, pure, and painfully obedient would become unbearable. Here's the quirky historical footnote. Isabella travelled with her own folding kneeler, so she could pray anywhere, at any time, on battlefields, in palaces, even at sea. Imagine that level of commitment. You're on a swaying ship crossing the Bay of Biscay, and instead of holding on for dear life, you're kneeling in a corset, asking God to bless your cousin's sperm. And yet historians still argue over her legacy. Some see her as a brilliant unifier, a female ruler who achieved what few women had before. Others, more recent scholars, see her as the architect of dynastic implosion, someone who lit a fire and refused to notice the smoke. The truth is probably both. She was undeniably powerful. But she was also the first domino in a row that would eventually lead to the Habsburg jaw, the Bourbon haemophilia, and an entire line of queens and princesses who suffered in silence under the banner of familial loyalty. Her health holds up better than many of her descendants. She dies at 53, after a slow decline marked by dropsy, exhaustion, and an aching sense that something isn't quite right. Maybe she sees the edge of the abyss, maybe not. Her will famously includes requests for a modest burial and for the preservation of the Catholic faith above all else. She's entombed next to Ferdinand beneath the altar of Granada Cathedral, the very city she conquered and converted. There's something darkly poetic about that. A queen so devoted to religious and dynastic purity that she ends her life buried in the heart of a city she scrubbed of its former soul. And above her, stained glass, glass windows depict the Virgin Mary and the family crest, symbols of grace and bloodline, always the bloodline. You step out of Isabella's shadow now, but her presence doesn't really leave. She's in every chapter that follows, in every royal nursery where a child's jaw doesn't close properly, in every whispered story about madness and miscarriage, in every pair of eyes that look a little too close together on the family portrait. She didn't intend it, maybe, but she wrote the first line of the story we're still telling. So light a candle, or say a prayer, Isabella would have wanted that. But as you do, remember what she passed down. A legacy not of glory, but of slow, generational collapse, dressed in velvet and justified by God. You're standing in the dim halls of El Escorial again, the massive, brooding royal complex outside Madrid, where Habsburg dreams went to echo and die. Stone everywhere. Cold, grey, breath-stealing stone. And deep in the portraits that hang above the great staircases is the pale face of Maria Anna of Spain. Look closely and you'll see something familiar. That signature Habsburg jaw, thick lower lip, and an expression that wavers between obedience and exhaustion. Maria Anna doesn't just carry the family legacy, she wears it on her face like a brand. Born in 1606, Maria Anna is the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria. Yep, another round of cousins playing house. By the time she arrives, the Habsburg family tree has collapsed into something closer to a family wreath. Her parents are double first cousins sharing all 4 grandparents. That's not romantic, it's a genetic crisis with lace ruffles. And in Maria Anna, she's born into that quiet nightmare with no say in the matter. From the beginning, she's treated less like a child and more like a porcelain statue. Precious, displayed, and entirely without agency. Her jaw is already prominent as a baby. Early signs of mandibular prognathism, the infamous Habsburg jaw. The family brushes it off as a trait of nobility. That's the disturbing part. Deformities weren't seen as warnings, they were seen as hallmarks of breeding. You weren't sick, you were pure. She's raised in the glittering but suffocating Spanish court, taught by governesses and priests. Everything is about religion. The girls must kneel just right, recite just right, suffer just right, and Maria Anna excels at it. Piety becomes her armour. It's one of the few things a royal woman can own. She learns how to endure, how to vanish behind veils and prayers. But even from a young age, it's clear her health isn't great. She's prone to migraines, fatigue, fainting spells. The palace whispers, but no one questions whether the family line might be to blame. No, they say, it's just her temperament. At 24, she's married off to her own uncle. Take a moment with that. Her uncle, the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand III, her mother's brother. The marriage is presented as a masterstroke of diplomacy. Spain and Austria reuniting through blood. Except that blood is already diluted, warped, recycled. The ceremony is ornate, overflowing with gold and incense. But the reality is genetic madness covered in pearls. In portraits from that time, Maria Anna's face becomes even more unmistakably Habsburg. Her chin juts forward, her lips curve awkwardly, but what the artist couldn't paint is what's happening inside her body. Chronic digestive issues, joint pain, anxiety that turns into full-blown panic in her later years. She gives birth to 6 children, but only 3 survive past infancy. One of her daughters is so physically frail that she's kept out of public view entirely. Another son will carry the Habsburg features even more aggressively, ensuring the family resemblance continues like a slow-moving curse. And yet Maria Anna is considered a good empress. She plays the part well, attends mass, gives charity, hosts grand events with a calm dignity. She doesn't complain, even when her teeth begin to fail her. Her speeches become softer, shorter. Her health falters publicly for the first time during the last pregnancy. She hemorrhages as Sarah hedges, but lives. Barely. And afterward, she's quieter than ever. She begins to retreat from court functions. Some say she found peace in faith, others suggest she knew what was coming for her children and simply couldn't bear to watch. Now here's the scholarly debate. Was Maria Anna's visible deformity and chronic health decline the result of cumulative inbreeding, or were her ailments simply common for women of her time and class? That's the challenge when studying history through a genetic lens. There are few medical records, and even fewer people willing to admit that their beloved monarchy was rotting from the inside. But when multiple descendants from multiple generations have the same facial bone structure and reproductive issues, it's no longer coincidence, it's pattern. And there's something deeply unsettling about how normalised this became. Royal advisors, doctors, and even artists all learned to navigate around the elephant in the palace. The jaw, just a royal trait. The mental fog, piety, the infertility, God's will, no one dared say what was obvious. The line was falling apart one generation at a time, and the women were the ones absorbing the fallout. Here's your quirky detail of the night. Despite her deteriorating health, Maria Anna was known for a bizarre hobby, designing elaborate lace patterns in total silence for hours each day. She never spoke while doing it. Some courtiers believed it was a meditative act. Others whispered that it was her way of mentally escaping the body she no longer trusted. She'd just sit there, lace on her lap, hands moving like clockwork while her mind went somewhere quieter, somewhere with fewer expectations, fewer uncles as husbands, and maybe a jaw that didn't hurt every time she chewed. She dies at 39. The official story is a wasting illness, which again is old school code for we don't know, but it was probably awful. She's buried in Vienna, in the crypt beneath the Capuchin church, where you can still visit her coffin today, another slab of history stacked atop the others, her legacy sealed in bronze. Maria Anna leaves behind a family that looks more and more like hers every generation. The jaw gets longer, the bloodlines grow tighter, and the women, always the women, are the ones who bear the cost, in their bodies, their minds, and their silence. So when you hear that name, Maria Anna of Spain, don't picture just another figure in a painting with folded hands and tired eyes. Picture the weight she carried, the jaw that wouldn't let her sleep, the lace patterns that were maybe the only thing she ever truly chose, and the quiet way she held up an empire that was already starting to crack. You're somewhere you didn't expect to be on this journey. Mexico. Not the old Aztec temple Mexico, and not the modern bustling city you might know today, but something in between. Fragile, unsure, and trapped under a crown it never wanted. It's 1864, and riding a wave of bad ideas and worse politics comes Charlotte of Belgium, also known as Empress Carlota of Mexico. And trust me, if you think the Habsburgs had called it quits on inbreeding by now, they absolutely hadn't. They just packed it up, tied a pretty ribbon on top, and shipped it across the Atlantic. Charlotte is born in 1840, the only daughter of Leopold the Way of Belgium and Princess Louise of Orleans. Now, on paper, Belgium isn't even old enough to be playing the royal inbreeding game. It's barely a country at this point. But Charlotte, she's the product of the same gene pool as her Austrian cousins, her Spanish cousins, her French cousins. You get the picture. The old blood runs thick in her veins, and that blood is full of secrets. As a child, Charlotte is precocious, pious, and eerily mature. Everyone around her calls her brilliant, and to be fair, she probably is. Fluent in 4 languages by 10, already memorizing state protocols and writing formal letters by 12. But beneath that porcelain exterior is a kind of pressure cooker. Her mother dies when she's barely old enough to remember her, and her father, emotionally distant, icy in that perfectly Belgian way, never quite knows what to do with a daughter who doesn't smile when she should. So what do you do with a royal girl who's too smart, too serious, and too inconveniently unmarried? You marry her off to someone with a title in need of a throne. Enter Maximilian of Austria, younger brother to Emperor Franz Joseph. He's handsome, idealistic, and let's be honest, a little too fond of his own reflection. Their marriage is presented as a fairy tale, young glamorous royals ready to lead, full of reformist dreams and romantic ambition. But you already know this is no fairy tale. It's a trap wrapped in velvet. Maximilian is offered the throne of Mexico by Napoleon III, who is deeply invested in exporting European monarchy to the Americas like some kind of colonial subscription box. The Mexican people, not really consulted, but hey, it looks good on paper. Charlotte becomes Empress Carlota, and together with Maximilian she sails off in full regalia, bringing lace fans, European etiquette, and 400 years of dynastic arrogance with them. From the moment they arrive, it's a disaster. The Mexican people don't want foreign rulers. The support from European powers is lukewarm at best. Maximilian proves to be indecisive and politically naive, constantly outmaneuvered by revolutionaries and his own advisors. And Charlotte, she goes full empress. She embraces the role with such terrifying commitment that it becomes clear this isn't just duty, it's survival. She hosts elaborate state dinners while rebels gather outside the capital. She writes letters to European courts begging for troops, money, anything. She walks the palace halls in heavy velvet, giving orders with a kind of cold, glassy-eyed detachment that unnerves even her allies. The reality is she's unravelling, and fast. Here's where the open debate comes in. Was Carlotta's breakdown the result of stress, political betrayal, and personal loss? Or was it genetic destiny finally catching up to her? Historians are divided. Some say she cracked under the weight of seeing her empire fall apart and her husband spiral into defeat. Others point to signs of hereditary mental illness that had been whispered about in her family for generations. Delusions, paranoia, hallucinations. By 1806 she's seeing threats in every shadow, convinced that her food is being poisoned, that people are watching her from behind paintings. She begs the Pope for help and breaks down mid-audience, sobbing and incoherent. That's not just stress, that's something deeper. Meanwhile, Maximilian is captured and executed. Yes, executed. The Habsburg experiment in Mexico ends with a firing squad, and Charlotte? She isn't even in the country when it happens. She's in Europe, drifting through castles and mental institutions like a ghost. Her hair turns white within months. Her mind, once sharp and steel-trapped, dissolves into fear and confusion. For the rest of her life, 60 more years, she lives in seclusion. First in the Château de Bouchoux in Belgium, then eventually in total isolation. No official visits, no public appearances, just long walks in the garden, murmuring to herself, occasionally swimming at invisible enemies. Here's your quirky fringe fact. She reportedly kept a collection of broken dolls that she believed were her royal court. She'd arrange them in chairs around her room and speak to them as if they were ministers, courtiers, generals. Her servants learned not to move them, even by an inch. If they did, she'd notice. She always noticed. Now, some modern psychiatrists have attempted a posthumous diagnosis. Schizophrenia, perhaps, or late-onset psychosis. But others lean toward genetic vulnerability triggered by trauma. And what trauma it was, losing her husband, her crown, her country, and most of her sanity in the space of a single decade. And yet, one has to wonder, would she have broken so completely if her blood hadn't already carried the warning signs? Charlotte dies in March 27 at the age of 86, having spent over 60 years in exile from the world, locked in a fading estate where mirrors were covered and clocks stopped ticking. Her name is barely whispered by European royals by then, too messy, too embarrassing, too close to the truth of their own fragile lineage. But her legacy is impossible to ignore. Because Charlotte is what happens when a royal woman is born into too much pressure and not enough choice. When her genes are already frayed and the system around her insists on pulling tighter and tighter. She went to Mexico with a dream and came back broken, body intact, mind in ruins. And if that's not a perfect metaphor for the royal bloodline she came from, I don't know what is. So leave her now, in her quiet room with the curtains drawn and the dolls waiting patiently. She's one of the loudest silences in royal history. A woman bred for greatness swallowed by madness. The mirror doesn't lie, but you wish it would. You're Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, and every single morning starts with this. 4 hours in front of your reflection. Not out of vanity, but necessity. Your hair alone takes 2 maids and an entire bottle of rose oil to manage. You weigh yourself obsessively. You eat next to nothing, milk and oranges, maybe a bit of broth, and then ride your horse for hours as if motion might somehow free you from the suffocating pedigree you were born into. Born in 1837, Elizabeth isn't supposed to be empress. Her older sister is the one being groomed for the role, but when Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria, meets them both, he doesn't choose the polished, prepared one. He picks Sisi, the younger, quieter, dreamier girl with waist-length chestnut hair and eyes that don't quite meet yours. He thinks he's found something special. What he's really found is someone young enough to mould and isolated enough to control. Sisi marries into the Habsburg dynasty at just 16. Her husband? A first cousin, naturally. The bloodline remains the priority, and what better way to ensure it than to tighten it just a bit more? Austria's crown becomes her prison almost immediately. She's whisked away to Vienna, where the air is cold and the court is colder. Her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, runs the palace with an iron corset, and considers Sisi little more than a necessary womb. She isn't allowed to raise her own children. She isn't allowed to make her own decisions. She isn't even allowed to grieve in private when her infant daughter dies. Sophie takes care of all that too, so Sisi retreats. Not physically, she's still there, gliding through balls dressed in diamonds, but spiritually. She begins building a fortress of rituals, a daily obsession with her body, her image, her thinness. Her waist shrinks to 19 inches, corseted so tightly that she occasionally faints in public. She becomes almost mythologically beautiful, and the people adore her for it. But inside, she's splintering, and her Habsburg blood doesn't help. The dynasty she married into is already falling apart from the inside. Madness, suicide, deformities, it's all there, tucked behind elaborate titles and stiff portraits. Sisi is acutely aware of it. She even refers to the court as a morgue of living corpses. She knows the curse she's become part of. She just can't escape it. So she tries to outrun it, literally. Riding her horses for hours, fencing, hiking alpine trails in full velvet like some kind of fairy tale fugitive. But no matter how far she goes, Hungary, Greece, the seas of Corfu, she always finds herself standing still in that mirror again, counting ribs, watching time bend her features. Her mental health begins to fracture. She writes long cryptic poems full of death imagery, self-hatred, and veiled references to being trapped in a world she cannot change. She begins to wear only black after her son, Crown Prince Rudolph, dies in an apparent murder-suicide pact at Mayerling. That moment breaks what little part of her is still whole. After that, she stops allowing anyone to photograph her. She walks veiled, refuses to be touched, avoids speaking unless absolutely necessary. Here's the scholarly divide. Was Cece's obsession with beauty a form of control in a world where she had none? Or was it a symptom, an early expression of body dysmorphia, depression, or even inherited mental illness passed down from centuries of royal entanglement? It's likely both. She shows clear signs of trauma, anxiety, and obsessive-compulsive behaviour, and yet she functions, sort of. She continues to travel endlessly, sometimes without telling anyone where she's going. She writes sad little verses in hotel rooms, leaves unfinished letters, rides horses until her knees give out. And through it all, her genetic legacy quietly haunts the next generation. Her children suffer. Her son dies tragically. Her daughters are distant, unhappy. The Habsburg line narrows and weakens, with whispers of haemophilia, infertility, and madness creeping through the margins of royal reports. Cece's perfect image does nothing to slow the rot, it only masks it. Here's your strange bedtime fact. Cece had a personal scale built into her castle floor so she could weigh herself daily without anyone seeing. She even had a daily routine of being measured at the waist to ensure her corset was laced exactly the same every morning. If her waist expanded by even half an inch, she would skip meals for days. It wasn't glamour, it was ritualistic self-erasure. Cece's life ends in a swirl of silence and irony. She's travelling incognito in Geneva in 1898 when she's stabbed in the heart by an Italian anarchist. Her corset is laced so tightly that she doesn't realise she's dying. She actually walks several blocks before collapsing. A royal bloodline that had survived centuries of war, intermarriage and childbirth is ultimately undone by a sharpened file and an open coat. And the world mourns. But it doesn't really see her. They remember the hair, the waist, the mystery. They forget the girl who was shipped off to marry her cousin, whose children were taken from her, whose mind gradually splintered from beauty and blood. The Empress becomes a statue, a myth, but not a warning. So if you ever find yourself in Vienna, look for the marble monument of Cece tucked among the hedges of the Volksgarten. It's beautiful, yes, but look a little closer. Her face isn't peaceful, it's distant, watching something you can't see. Maybe it's the future, maybe it's the slow crumbling of everything she tried to hold together with pins and pearls. You walk away now from a woman who tried to control the uncontrollable, who tried to outrun the curse in her blood and instead became part of its final chapter. Her name is still spoken with awe, but if you ask her reflection, she probably wouldn't recognise it. There's a draught in the palace, but it's not the kind that makes you shiver. It's the kind that rustles silk skirts and sends candle flames dancing nervously. In one of Bavaria's many gleaming halls, you're watching a young woman walk slowly, deliberately, as if afraid her body might crack. This is Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, born in 1826, and by all outward appearances, she's a model royal. Elegant, soft-spoken, deeply pious, but inside her head, a world is unravelling in the quietest, strangest way possible. Alexandra isn't just anxious or depressed, though she is definitely both. She believes something very specific, something so bizarre it feels like the setup for a Grimm's fairy tale gone wrong. She is convinced, absolutely and unshakably, that as a child she swallowed a grand, full-size glass piano. Not a figurine, not a toy, a piano. And now she walks carefully through life, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter her from the inside out. It sounds like a metaphor, doesn't it? Except it isn't. It's a documented delusion, known now in the psychiatric world as glass delusion, a rare and historically fascinating form of psychosis that affected several nobles during the Renaissance and beyond. But Alexandra is a rare case because hers lasts well into adulthood, long after the trend of delicate minds being fashionable has passed. And even more hauntingly, it goes untreated. Or rather, it's treated the way everything else in royal Europe is treated, with prayers, isolation, and an enormous amount of denial. You start to understand the pressure that must have carved this delusion into her. Alexandra is the daughter of King Ludwig I of Bavaria and Queen Therese. Yes, the same Therese who lent her name to the famed Oktoberfest. But unlike beer festivals and marching bands, Alexandra's childhood is joyless. Her family is rigidly Catholic, obsessed with morality and appearances. Her older siblings include King Maximilian II and various other Bavarian royals, many of whom struggle with anxiety, depression, and in one case, possible undiagnosed schizophrenia. The family tree is full of first-cousin marriages and alliances designed to preserve not just power, but purity. And Alexandra, she's the perfect vessel for both. Her education is extensive and she excels in literature and languages. But beneath that polished surface, something is off. She becomes increasingly withdrawn, obsessed with cleanliness, terrified of noise and disruption. Her glass piano delusion begins in her teens and never really leaves her. She walks slowly, speaks softly, avoids crowds. Every step, every movement is controlled. Her family, naturally, does not publicise this. It's whispered about, never confirmed. But servants tell stories of the strange, silent girl who moved through the palace like a ghost, afraid to sit down too quickly, convinced that a sneeze might crack her ribcage. Here's where the debate comes in. Was Alexandra's delusion purely psychological, or did it have roots in the generations of inbreeding that preceded her? Glass delusion isn't exactly hereditary, but the underlying causes, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, psychosis, absolutely can be. And when you take a woman already predisposed to mental fragility and place her in a palace that runs on silence, shame and genetic hubris, what do you expect to happen? The Bavarian court, in typical 19th century fashion, responds by increasing her religious obligations. She's encouraged to pray more, to fast, to engage in long silent retreats. At one point it's rumoured she refuses to eat anything but soft bread soaked in rosewater, fearing even the crunch of food might disrupt the glass instrument inside her. There are no medical interventions, no psychiatrists, just the assumption that with enough faith and discipline the delusion will dissolve. It doesn't. Instead, Alexandra grows older, more fragile. She never marries. No surprise there. Who would marry a woman who believes she's a walking chandelier? But the official story is spun differently. She's too devout, too pure, too pious for earthly companionship. She becomes something of a court mascot, a living relic of Bavaria's fading golden age. Occasionally she publishes poetry, most of it melancholy and abstract, full of themes of fragility, transparency, and the unbearable weight of being seen. Some modern scholars argue these poems are coded cries for help. Others think they are simply the only way she knew how to exist in a world where her body, her mind, and her story were never fully hers. Her death in 1875 is uneventful, at least on paper. She dies quietly in her palace rooms as still unmarried, still obsessed with cleanliness and decorum. But legend says that in her final weeks, she began to talk about the piano again, that she worried she'd leave shards behind, that she asked for no one to touch her body after death, lest they be cut. Whether that's true or just another piece of royal folklore is unclear, but it fits, doesn't it? A life spent holding yourself together, ending with one final whisper of breaking. And here's your curious bedtime detail. Alexandra often wore only white, not for fashion, but for safety. She believed the colour symbolised transparency, like glass, and helped her remain unseen. It was also easier to notice if a piece of her had, God forbid, shattered. Servants recalled her gliding through the palace like a ghost bride, pressing herself along walls, her skirts rustling like the faintest wind. So what do we make of her? Was she a victim of genetics? Of a system that prized image over wellness? Absolutely, but she was also a woman ahead of her time in an eerie way. She understood fragility as something both mental and physical. She lived the metaphor. And in a royal culture where women were treated like delicate ornaments, valued only for their ability to reflect male power, it almost makes sense that she'd believe herself made of glass. You leave her now in her pristine white room, windows shuttered, mirrors turned to the walls. She never broke, not really. She just stayed still for so long the world passed by without ever touching her. A glass piano that never played a note. The silk is powdered with cake flour to mimic snow, the perfume so thick it sticks to your throat. Welcome to Versailles in the late 1700s. More artifice than substance, more performance than politics. And at the centre of it all, Marie Antoinette, The woman who even centuries later can't seem to catch a break. Was she a villain? A victim? A clueless teenager with too much money? Yes. Also, she was inbred. Let's not tiptoe around it. Born in 1755, Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna of Austria is the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa and Emperor Francis I. That's not a typo, 15th. By the time she arrives, the Habsburg family line has been stitched together so tightly it might as well be a loop. Her parents are double second cousins, and her grandparents were part of that same cosy gene pool. The Habsburgs have been marrying their cousins, nieces and uncles for so long by now that they probably needed a flowchart to remember which Charles was which. Maria Antonia is raised in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, where formality is suffocating and court life is steeped in tradition. Education is a secondary concern. After all, she's not expected to rule, just to marry well. She grows up speaking French, dancing and playing the harp, but barely learns to read and write. By the time she's 14, she's engaged to the French Dauphin, Louis Auguste, future Louis XVI. Her mother's plan is clear: unite Austria and France through a teenage girl's womb. The marriage is a disaster before it even begins. Marie Antoinette arrives in France in 1770, a child bride dressed in brocade, and immediately has her name changed, her clothes burned and her identity stripped. She's thrust into the pressure cooker of Versailles, where nothing is private and everything is political. Everyone is watching, everyone is judging, and she, unprepared and alone, begins to spin. It takes her and Louis 7 years to consummate the marriage. The palace whispers are merciless. Is she barren? Is he impotent? Is she trying to destroy the alliance? The pressure is endless. When she finally does conceive, she's practically paraded through the palace like a prize sow. And still, the people hate her. They call her l'Autrichienne, a play on Austrian woman and bitch. And behind the insults is a real undercurrent of fear. This foreign queen with strange habits and strange blood might corrupt the French line. But Marie, she adapts. Poorly, yes, but she does. She finds solace in extravagance, fashion, theatre, pretend farms and silk ribbons and feathery hats taller than her footmen. To outsiders, she seems frivolous. And she is. But it's also survival. She's been locked in a golden cage since age 14 and told that her worth lies entirely in her fertility and decorum. When you're stuck in a role that offers no way out, sometimes you start performing it too well. And yet her health begins to show cracks. Chronic fatigue, digestive problems, mood swings. Near the end of her reign, she suffers multiple miscarriages and is rumoured to have developed uterine problems, though the records, as always, are vague and sanitised. Some historians suggest she may have had endometriosis, or another undiagnosed reproductive illness, possibly exacerbated by inbreeding or the stress of her position. Others argue it was simply exhaustion, but really, it could be both. Royal women were expected to produce children like assembly lines. Marie Antoinette did, 4 of them to be precise, and buried 2. And here's the strange scholarly twist. The French Bourbons, into whom she married, were also the product of centuries of cousin-based matchmaking. So when you look at her children, especially Louis Charles, the doomed Dauphin, you see signs of physical frailty and poor immunity. He dies in prison at age 10 after months of neglect, malnourishment and disease. But many believe he was already weakened from birth. It's hard to prove genetic issues from skeletons and court drawings, but the pattern, by now, is hard to ignore. Versailles falls. The revolution surges like a tidal wave. Louis is tried and executed. Marie Antoinette follows 10 months later, dragged to the guillotine in a battered cart, her hair hacked short, her face bloated and sick from months in a damp prison cell. The once dazzling queen is now a symbol of decadence, a scapegoat for everything wrong with the monarchy. She walks up the scaffold with dignity, but she is no longer the girl in silk. She is a hollowed-out shell of what her bloodline asked her to be. But here's your quirky bedtime detail. In her final days, she refused to see a priest, saying she had made peace with her soul and didn't need the trappings of a church that had abandoned her. The same woman who once spent hours arranging flowers in porcelain vases died with calloused hands, untreated illness, and a name that history still spits out like a sour candy. There's a debate, of course. Was Marie Antoinette a tragic pawn or a callous aristocrat? Did she deserve her fate, or was she born doomed by the systems around her? Probably both, but what's often forgotten is how much of her life was shaped not by choice, but by blood. thick, tangled European royal blood that had long since stopped caring about the health of its daughters. She was chosen for who her parents were. She died because of what she represented, and in between she tried to be something more, but the role was too tight. So when you picture her, don't just see the powdered wig and satin. See the girl who arrived at court without a friend, the queen who bled through her gowns after miscarriage number 3, the mother who lost 2 children before her own head was taken. And somewhere in that image, try to hear her last words, not the famous misattributed "let them eat cake," but her actual final phrase, said to the executioner after accidentally stepping on his foot, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Because that's the real Marie. Misunderstood, miscast, and perhaps most of all misborn. The chapel is silent, but not peacefully so. It's the kind of silence that feels stiff and over-perfumed, like someone trying to hide a sickness with lavender. You're in the heart of Madrid in the early 1600s, and a woman kneels on cold marble, murmuring prayers through clenched teeth. This is Anna of Austria, Queen of Spain and Portugal, and another cog in the machine of royal bloodlines so tightly wound they're beginning to squeak audibly. Her skin is pale, her frame fragile, and her jaw, well, that Habsburg jaw is still right there, refusing to be ignored. Born in 1549 to Emperor Maximilian II and Maria of Spain, herself the daughter of Charles V, Anna is, unsurprisingly, yet another product of a very narrow gene pool. Her parents are first cousins. Her grandparents were uncle and niece. By the time Anna comes into the world, the family bloodline is less a tree and more a very ambitious vine that has looped around the same post for generations. And you can see it, literally, in the portraits. Drooping eyes, elongated faces, that famous jutting chin. But Anna is considered beautiful by the standards of the day. Delicate, devout, submissive. All the traits a 16th century royal woman is expected to offer like a bouquet of lilies. She is by all reports gentle and kind, the kind of queen people remember fondly, if not vividly. Her education is deeply religious, and she internalises every word. By adolescence, she's already fasting to the point of fainting, flagellating herself for impure thoughts, and slipping into long periods of silent devotion. It's unclear whether this is piety or something more complicated, anxiety perhaps, or a subtle form of dissociation. Either way, it's treated like sainthood. At 20, she's married off to her uncle, Philip II of Spain. Yes, uncle. Let that settle in for a moment. Not a distant cousin, not a second-degree something, her literal, blood-related uncle. It's one of the most egregious consanguineous marriages in a royal house already famous for towing that line. But the Spanish court calls it fate, divine will, even a romantic twist. Because what better way to keep the crown in the family than to marry your niece? Philip is cold, meticulous, and obsessed with control. He'd already been married 3 times before Anna, including to Queen Mary of England, and he wasn't particularly affectionate with any of them. With Anna, he seems more resigned than enamoured, but the marriage is productive in the only way that matters to royal historians. Anna gives him children. 10 pregnancies, 5 survive. The most notable, Philip III of Spain, who would go on to continue the family's love affair with internal gene pooling. But Anna's pregnancies are difficult. Each one takes a visible toll. Her body, never robust, begins to decline quickly. She suffers from fevers, migraines, and bleeding that won't stop. The royal doctors hover uselessly, prescribing the usual array of medieval remedies, herbs, prayers, purgatives. One particularly odd treatment involves wrapping her feet in slices of raw meat. No, it doesn't help, but it does give the court something to gossip about. The open debate here is whether Anna suffered from a genetic immune disorder, a possibility modern researchers find compelling given her symptoms, or if she was simply worn down by relentless childbearing and untreated infections. Either way, her decline is steady. She dies at 30 after complications from her final childbirth. The official record says acute postpartum fever. Unofficially, her body gave out after years of reproductive strain made worse by a gene pool so narrow it could barely stand upright. And here's the particularly grim twist. Philip is devastated by her death. Genuinely. He orders a mourning period so strict that courtiers aren't allowed to wear anything brighter than slate grey for months. He has her room sealed, her dresses preserved. For a man so emotionally distant, his grief is uncharacteristically public. Some circulate its guilt. He married a teenager who was genetically vulnerable, used her to churn out heirs, and then buried her when she couldn't do it anymore. Here's your strange bedtime fact. After Anna's death, Philip commissions a wax death mask of her face which he keeps in his private prayer room for the rest of his life. Visitors say he spoke to it during moments of crisis, sometimes even consulting it before major decisions. That's not romantic. That's deeply unsettling. Anna's story is often eclipsed by her husband's broader role in Spanish imperialism, or by her son's disastrous reign, or by the even more famously inbred royals who would follow. But she's a critical link in the chain. Her marriage to Philip further condensed the already too close Habsburg genome, ensuring that the next generation would carry forward even more pronounced physical and psychological frailty. And she's not remembered for her mind or her politics. She's remembered for her womb, her ability to carry forward a name, even as it crushed her from the inside out. In death, she's canonized in the court's memory as a holy figure, a perfect queen. But look closely at her portraits. Her eyes aren't calm. They're tired. They know too much for someone so young. And when you walk through the Escorial past the tombs and altars, it's her Sichtheit you feel first. Long, cold, obedient. Anna of Austria doesn't scream in the halls of history. She doesn't leave behind scandalous letters or wild affairs. But her body, worn thin by blood and duty, tells a story that echoes through every one of her descendants, a warning wrapped in lace. The rooms are thick with rosewater and hushed conversation, every corner of Windsor Castle holding its breath. Outside, the world moves on, horse carriages, fog and British rain, but inside time is paused around one of the most delicate members of the royal household. This is Princess Amelia of the United Kingdom, youngest daughter of King George III, and even among a family famous for its quirks, her life is steeped in a kind of soft tragedy. She is born into privilege and pressure, and both will smother her long before her time. Amelia comes into the world in 1783, the 15th and final child of George III and Queen Charlotte. By now, the royal nursery is more of a political institution than a family. Her older siblings range from ambitious military men to troubled daughters locked into a carousel of unwanted suitors. Amelia is the baby of the brood, and perhaps for that reason she is adored, especially by her father. George dotes on her obsessively, calling her his most beloved daughter. But that affection, as sweet as it may seem, becomes more of a cage than a comfort. From early childhood, Amelia's health is questionable. She catches every illness. Her bones ache, she bruises easily, sleeps poorly, and is often described as frail in family letters. Royal code for we don't know what's wrong but we know it's bad. Some modern scholars speculate she suffered from a form of porphyria, an inherited metabolic disorder that causes pain, sensitivity to light and neurological issues. That same condition is now often retroactively diagnosed in her father as well, suggesting a genetic thread winding through the Hanoverian line like a fraying ribbon. And yes, the family line is twisted. Her parents were not first cousins, but the gene pool wasn't exactly a model of diversity either. Queen Charlotte descended from a long line of German princelings, many of whom had married within the same dozen noble houses for centuries. The Hanovers, while less notorious than the Habsburgs in this regard, still operated under the assumption that nobility trumped genetics every time. You didn't marry for health, you married for alliance, and if your children came out sickly or disturbed, you called it a divine mystery and moved on. But Amelia is different. She's bright, musical, and painfully sensitive. Everyone notes her empathy. She writes letters full of introspection and longing, dreams of romance, and spends hours sketching or playing music in her private rooms. She falls in love, deeply, hopelessly, with a cavalry officer named Charles Fitzroy. He is beneath her, of course. Not royal, not acceptable. Her family forbids the match. She is heartbroken, and worse, she starts to fade. Her health begins to unravel in earnest by the time she's in her late teens. She develops a chronic cough, loses weight rapidly, and becomes bedridden for long stretches. The royal doctors hover like ravens, offering her mixtures of opium, laudanum, and bleeding treatments, none of which help, and all of which make her more fragile. She tries to maintain her dignity, but her letters grow shorter, more erratic. She writes to her sisters in careful, apologetic tones, as if afraid her suffering is an inconvenience. Here's the debate. Was Amelia's decline due purely to tuberculosis, as officially recorded, or was something deeper happening? Perhaps a genetic immune deficiency or a degenerative disorder, passed down through generations of controlled breeding. Some scholars lean toward the latter. noting that her symptoms don't align neatly with just one illness. It could have been a perfect storm, tuberculosis layered over a body already weakened by the compounded mistakes of dynastic obsession. Her father, George III, spirals into full mental collapse around this time, a descent that coincides eerily with her decline. The two had always been emotionally enmeshed, and her illness devastates him. Some accounts say he spoke to empty rooms, believing she was still alive after her death. Others suggest her suffering accelerated his own. It's a tragic feedback loop. A sick daughter, a crumbling father, both caged in a system that valued legacy over life. Amelia dies in 1810 at just 27 years old. In her final days, she is said to have asked for a lock of Charles Fitzroy's hair to be buried with her, a quiet act of rebellion in a life otherwise defined by submission. Her death is a private family tragedy, but it becomes a public crisis when it utterly breaks the king. George III is declared permanently unfit to rule shortly after. The Regency Act is passed. The royal machinery grinds forward, but a piece of its heart is gone. Here's your soft, strange detail for the night. Amelia kept a personal collection of pressed flowers from every garden she visited. Hundreds of tiny flattened petals, labelled and dated with handwritten notes in faded ink. The last flower she pressed was a white rose, just days before her death. She labelled it simply "Still Breathing." She is buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, away from the political centre, but close enough for her memory to haunt the halls. There's no grand statue for her, no national monument, just her name on a plaque, tucked between more famous royals forgotten by most history books. But if you pause and listen, really listen, you can still hear her in the hush of those palace rooms. A woman who wanted to live, to love and to choose, but who was born into a legacy that offered none of those things. She didn't write treaties, she didn't lead armies, but her death shook a monarchy, and her frailty, beautiful, tragic and entirely preventable, remains one of the quietest indictments of royal bloodline obsession. So leave her gently now, wrapped in pressed flowers and remembered by those who knew her best. She wasn't loud, but she was real, and sometimes that's all that matters. It starts with a tiny bruise, a pinprick blotch on the arm of a royal baby. Nothing alarming at first, just something small and oddly slow to fade. Then another appears, then more, and soon every minor bump leaves a mark. The bleeding doesn't stop, not from a scraped knee, not from a pulled tooth, and certainly not from childbirth. You are Victoria, Queen of the United Kingdom, Empress of India, and, without knowing it, the genetic epicenter of a royal crisis that will ripple through Europe for generations. Your legacy, not just empire, but haemophilia. Victoria is born in 1818, the daughter of Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. The British royal line is sturdy on the surface, but behind the curtain, it's a web of German blood, cousin marriages, and just enough randomness to brew something dangerous. She marries her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, handsome, moralising and determined to reorganise the monarchy like a Protestant cult with good lighting. Together, they have 9 children, that's 9 potential carriers. Victoria is healthy, robust even. She lives into her 80s, ruling an empire and collecting titles like commemorative plates. But tucked inside her chromosomes is a genetic mutation, an uninvited glitch in the X chromosome she passes to several of her children. Haemophilia, a disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. And in an era with no antibiotics, no transfusions, and no understanding of genetics, it is a death sentence wrapped in velvet. The disease reveals itself first in her son Leopold. He bruises easily, suffers internal bleeding, and dies at 30 from a minor fall, just tripping literally into eternity. But he's only the beginning. Victoria's daughters, Alice and Beatrice, carry the gene forward into the royal bloodlines of Germany, Spain and Russia. Suddenly, what was once an unlucky diagnosis becomes a dynastic curse. Haemophilia spreads through the crowned heads of Europe like a silent invasion, disguised in christening gowns and court portraits. And Victoria? She has no idea, or maybe she does and chooses not to dwell on it. She's deeply superstitious and fiercely controlling, but science isn't her strong suit. She writes obsessively about court life, social reforms, and how much she dislikes her children's wives, but rarely mentions the illness that's killing her descendants. Perhaps because she can't. No one wants to admit that the matriarch of modern monarchy is also patient zero. Here's the scholarly debate. Where did the mutation come from? Some argue that Victoria inherited it through a spontaneous genetic mutation, since there's no history of haemophilia in her ancestors. Others think it may have come through her mother's line, the Coburgs, but was masked until it hit the unlucky jackpot with Victoria. Either way, the mutation becomes one of the most devastating in modern royal history. Her daughter Alice passes it to her own son, Friedrich, who dies bleeding from a fall. Another of Alice's daughters, Alex, marries Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and there the tragedy multiplies. Their son Alexei is a haemophiliac, and his suffering becomes so unbearable, so chronic, that his mother turns to mystics for help. Enter Rasputin. Yes, that Rasputin. His inexplicable ability to calm Alexei's bleeding episodes gives him influence over the Russian court, ultimately helping destabilize an already crumbling regime. The Russian Revolution isn't caused by haemophilia, of course, but the presence of the illness adds fuel to the fire. The imperial family is seen as cursed, weak, and divinely punished. Haemophilia is the secret everyone knows but no one discusses. At royal dinners, bruises are covered with lace. When a child dies from a simple injury, the official cause is always something vague: decline, fever, sorrow. Beatrice's children also inherit the gene, carrying it into the Spanish royal family, where it will quietly take out infants and young boys for decades. One of Victoria's grandsons, Prince Waldemar of Prussia, bleeds to death in 1945 because hospitals refused to treat him during the chaos of World War II. His condition? Haemophilia, the gift that keeps on taking. Here's your fringe bedtime fact. In the early 1800s, German doctors attempted a bizarre treatment for royal haemophiliacs, injecting them with lamb's blood. It didn't work, of course, and several patients died of allergic reactions, but the desperation was real. You couldn't let the public know that your future kings were dying from skinned elbows. Victoria's later years are filled with grief, so many of her children and grandchildren die young or live in pain. But she remains oddly detached from the biology of it all. She sees it as bad luck, divine mystery. She writes thousands of letters, but the word haemophilia never appears. Denial becomes its own kind of dynasty, and yet her empire continues. Her name is on half the world, her face is stamped on coins, her silhouette cast in stone. She lives so long, reigning for over 60 years, that she becomes a symbol of endurance. But behind the symbol is a woman who unintentionally cursed her family. Not with war, not with politics, but with a single gene. One X chromosome mutated quietly in the womb, enough to reshape the fate of empires. So what do we do with her now? Was she a tragic carrier, a woman out of her depth in a field no one understood yet? Or was she complicit, turning away from a pattern that grew more obvious with each funeral? Historians argue still, but the truth may be that she was both. A queen with a crown heavy enough to ignore science, a mother who saw her children bleed and simply added it to the list of divine burdens. You leave her now in her widow's black, clutching her ever-present handkerchief, mourning half a continent while holding on to power with white-knuckled precision. The great empress of the age, unknowingly the architect of Europe's quietest royal tragedy. Her legacy is massive, but so is her shadow. You're in Windsor Castle again, but this time the air feels thicker, less gilded, less certain. It's the 1880s, and a royal child is crying in the nursery, not because she's disobedient, but because she can't hear what the governess is saying. This is Princess Alice of Battenberg, and from the moment she opens her eyes in 1885, she's expected to perform a role that her body, and later her mind, seems determined to complicate. Alice is born into an extraordinary tangle of European royalty. Her mother, Princess Victoria of Hesse, is the daughter of Princess Alice of the United Kingdom, Queen Victoria's second daughter. Her father, Prince Louis of Battenberg, is German nobility with ties to nearly every crown in Europe. That means little Alice is Queen Victoria's great-granddaughter and a distant cousin to basically everyone with a title and a tiara. On paper, she's the perfect vessel for continuing the proud, increasingly chaotic legacy of Europe's ruling houses. But from the beginning, Alice doesn't follow the script. She's born profoundly deaf, though it takes a few years for anyone to notice. The court initially assumes she's simply slow or distracted, because what else could it be? Royal children aren't supposed to be disabled, they're supposed to be robust, healthy, ready to marry whoever is politically convenient. When her condition is finally acknowledged, it's treated with a kind of whispered discomfort. never quite named, never quite accepted. And yet Alice learns to lip read in multiple languages. She learns to speak carefully, with great concentration. She becomes fluent in English, French and German, reading lips in all three. She is, by all accounts, bright, curious, and unusually empathetic. But empathy doesn't make for good court performance, and soon her upbringing becomes a balancing act between duty and difference. She grows up travelling between palaces, often more visitor than daughter in any given room. Her mother is emotionally distant, consumed with social engagements and royal management. Her father, while loving, is often absent. Alice spends long stretches in near silence, floating between relatives who barely understand her, let alone communicate with her effectively. The isolation is quiet, not cruel, but it cuts just the same. At 17, Alice meets her to Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark. He's handsome, dashing, and also part of the same over-shuffled gene pool that seems to define every royal house by now. They marry in 1903 in a ceremony that draws more photographers than well-wishers. She becomes Princess Andrew of Greece and Denmark, and by all accounts she is determined to embrace her role. But Greece is no picnic. The country is politically unstable, the monarchy fragile, and soon Alice finds herself bouncing between palaces and safe houses as war, revolution and exile pull her new family apart. She gives birth to 5 children, including a boy named Philip, the future Duke of Edinburgh. Yes, that Philip. And her pregnancies are not easy. Each one chips away at her stamina. Her health becomes unpredictable, and then, sometime in the early 20s, her mind begins to fray. Alice becomes obsessed with the religious visions. She claims to hear the voice of God. She insists she has healing powers. She stops eating, stops speaking for days at a time, and begins telling people she is receiving divine instructions. Her family, horrified, embarrassed, has her committed to a mental institution in Switzerland. She is diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, though modern scholars question that. Some suggest she may have suffered from bipolar disorder, or a severe depressive episode worsened by stress and genetic predisposition. Either way, she is institutionalized and separated from her children for years. Her husband abandons her. Her daughters marry German princes and quietly stop mentioning her. Philip, her only son, is sent to live with other relatives, bouncing between households in France, Germany and Britain, never really belonging anywhere. And Alice, she spends years alone, monitored by doctors, drifting in and out of lucidity. At one point, Carl Jung is consulted for her treatment. He suggests her religious experiences are symbolic of an identity crisis. How quaint. Here's your strange, shimmering fact. During her time in the asylum, Alice corresponded with Sigmund Freud. Yes, that Freud. He reportedly recommended an X-ray to her ovaries in order to curb her religious eroticism, because when in doubt, blame the uterus. But Alice isn't done yet. After her release, she rededicates her life to religion. She becomes a nun, not just a fashionable high society nun, but a real habit-wearing, nursing the sick nun. She founds her own religious order and moves back to Greece during World War II, where she hides Jewish families in her apartment and outmaneuvers the Gestapo using little more than faith and nerves of steel. The same woman who once hallucinated divine messages is now risking her life to live them out. She survives the war, outlives her husband, attends her son's wedding to Queen Elizabeth II, wearing her nun's habit like it's the finest gown in the room. She lives her last years in Buckingham Palace, tucked away in a corner apartment, smoking heavily, praying constantly and rarely speaking. She dies in 1969, largely unknown to the public and long misunderstood by her family. And here's the debate. Was Alice mentally ill? Or was she a deeply spiritual woman broken by loss, war, and the crushing expectations of royal womanhood? Maybe both, but her story doesn't fit neatly into the tragedy box. Unlike many of the women we've met so far, Alice claws her way back. She doesn't escape her family, or her genetics, or the chaos of her era, but she transforms it. She becomes something else. So you leave her in that quiet room in Buckingham Palace, sitting in the window, hands folded over a worn prayer book, deaf and royal, exiled, misunderstood, and somehow still whole. One of the very few in this long line of inbred women who made it to the other side, not unscathed but unbroken. The bells of St. James's Palace ring, but not for a coronation or a wedding, they toll for loss. The year is 1817, and the British public is deep in mourning, not for a queen or a monarch, but for a young woman who never got the chance to become either. Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only legitimate grandchild of King George III, has died at 21, and with her goes the last real hope for a stable, sane future for the British throne. Charlotte's life is a short one, but it's heavy, weighted with pressure, national attention, and quiet health problems that people don't quite notice until it's far too late. Born in 1796, Charlotte is the daughter of George, Prince of Wales, later George IV, and Caroline of Brunswick, a woman he married purely out of obligation and loathed almost immediately. Their marriage is a train wreck from day one, the kind that unfolds in front of courtiers who pretend not to notice and servants who definitely do. The two separate soon after Charlotte is born. She's raised more by her nurses and tutors than by either parent, bouncing between households like a diplomatic football. George rarely sees her. Caroline is eventually exiled, literally, from court life. Charlotte grows up in an odd kind of half-light, beloved by the public but neglected in the places that actually matter. She's smart, opinionated, stubborn, and by the time she's a teenager, people are already calling her the future queen. Now, let's talk about the gene pool. George and Caroline were first cousins. Not particularly unusual for the time, especially among royals, but still close enough to raise eyebrows now. Their shared bloodline traces back through generations of intermarriage among the British, German, and Dutch nobility, which means Charlotte inherits more than just a title. She inherits the weight of dynastic entanglement. And in her case, it's not just metaphorical. Her body is quietly fighting against the very legacy it's meant to uphold. By her late teens, Charlotte begins suffering from what her doctors call hysterical afflictions. Sharp cramps, irregular periods, headaches, fainting spells. They chalk it up to nerves or stress, the standard excuses reserved for high-strung young women. Today, some scholars suggest these symptoms may have pointed to underlying reproductive issues, perhaps even a uterine malformation or blood clotting disorder. Of course, they didn't test for that in 1817. They just told her to rest and avoid excitement. But Charlotte wants excitement, or at least she wants love. She turns down several politically advantageous marriage proposals, including one from the future William of Orange. Instead, she insists on marrying Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg. Yes, another cousin, but a comparatively distant one. Leopold is gentle, handsome, and politically acceptable enough for the British crown to eventually cave. They marry in 1816, and for a brief, glittering moment, it feels like a fairy tale might actually take root. The public adores them. Charlotte blossoms. She's healthier, happier, glowing in public appearances. Leopold is doting. The couple settles into Claremont House away from the toxic stew of court politics and begins planning a future that includes children, reform, and a different kind of monarchy. But none of that happens. In November 1817, after a perfectly ordinary pregnancy, Charlotte goes into labour. It lasts over 50 hours. Her doctors, led by Sir Richard Croft, refuse to intervene. Forceps are available but not used. There's an almost reverent adherence to natural birth, despite the signs that things are going terribly wrong. The baby, a boy, is stillborn. Charlotte is exhausted, hemorrhaging, and weak. A few hours later, she dies. One doctor reportedly runs from the room and shoots himself in the head days later, unable to bear the guilt. Here's the chilling question historians still ask. Why did Charlotte die? Was it pure obstetric mismanagement? Or did something more insidious play a role? Like a clotting disorder passed through her tightly wound family tree? Haemophilia runs in the broader royal bloodline, as you know by now. So do autoimmune disorders. So do a dozen conditions no one in 1817 could diagnose, let alone treat. It's entirely possible her body was never strong enough to do what everyone demanded of it, produce the next heir to the throne. And her death isn't just a family tragedy, it's a national one. The public enters a full-blown period of mourning. Shops close. Black crepe sells out across the country. It's as if an entire nation had pinned its future on this one woman, and then watched her vanish. Politically, her death sets off a panic. With no legitimate heir, George III's sons scramble to marry and produce children. One of them, Edward, Duke of Kent, Charlotte's uncle, hastily marries a German princess. Their child will be Victoria. Yes, that Victoria. Charlotte's death is the reason Victoria becomes queen. It's the hinge moment in 19th century British royal history, and yet Charlotte herself fades quickly from memory, overshadowed by the woman who replaced her and the empire that woman built. There are statues, yes, a few portraits, but for someone who carried the hopes of an entire nation, she is largely forgotten outside royal history buffs and tragedy enthusiasts. Here's your fringe historical detail. After Charlotte's death, Leopold continued living at Claremont alone for years, sleeping in the room where she died. He never remarried while in Britain. Later he would become King of the Belgians and play a huge role in European politics, but he always carried a miniature portrait of Charlotte with him, inside his breast pocket, over his heart. So now you leave Charlotte where history left her, still young, still dressed in white, a woman who never got to rule but shaped the monarchy anyway. Her body couldn't survive the system she was born into, her son never took a breath, and yet their absence carved the path for a different kind of royal story, one you already know too well. In the end, Charlotte becomes one more figure in a long procession of royal women undone by their blood, their duty and their biology. But for a moment, she held the future, and then, just like that, it slipped away. The wind shifts east, and suddenly you're not in London anymore. You're standing in the grand golden halls of the Russian imperial court, staring into the sharp blue eyes of a woman who isn't supposed to be there. Not Russian, not Orthodox, not born to the Romanovs. Yet here she is, Catherine the Great, arguably the most powerful empress in Russian history. But behind the power, the myth, and the mountain of memoirs is a simple fact. Catherine wasn't just a political mastermind. She was also a participant, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps strategically, in the same dynastic gymnastics that defined Europe's crumbling royal bloodlines. Born in 1729 as Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, Catherine is a minor German princess, not exactly at the top of anyone's matchmaking list. Her family is noble but not wealthy, respectable but not especially relevant. Still, she's educated beyond expectation, fluent in French, schooled in Enlightenment philosophy, trained in the dance of European courtly etiquette before she even hits puberty. And when Empress Elizabeth of Russia starts searching for a bride for her nephew and heir, Grand Duke Peter, young Sophie suddenly becomes very interesting. Now, Grand Duke Peter, he's another story entirely. A Romanov by name, but a Holstein-Gottorp by blood, and deeply inbred even by royal standards. His mother and father were first cousins. His aunt and uncle were second cousins. The man has more repeat ancestors than a spreadsheet can comfortably handle. He's twitchy, unpredictable, immature. Some believe he suffers from a neurological condition. Others just think he's a spoiled man-child with a toy soldier obsession. Either way, he's not the prize he appears to be. But Catherine marries him anyway. She's 16, he's 17. Neither of them knows what they're getting into. Russia has plans, Europe has expectations, and their genes? Oh, their genes are very much along for the ride. From the start, the marriage is a catastrophe. Peter is uninterested in her. Some say he's impotent. Others say he simply preferred playing war games with his guards to spending any time in his wife's company. Catherine, ever pragmatic, begins reading Voltaire, Diderot, Machiavelli, and begins planning. If she can't win her husband's affection, she'll win Russia's. Here's where the bloodline loop tightens. Peter is technically a Romanov, but he's also a German duke. Catherine, likewise, is German. Their children, had things gone according to plan, would have been double German Romanovs, a concentrated cocktail of Northern European nobility. But then there's the quiet, enduring mystery of Paul, Catherine's son and heir. Officially, he is Peter's child, but many historians believe he may have been fathered by one of Catherine's lovers, perhaps Sergei Saltykov, a Russian nobleman and one of her earliest confidants. If that's true, then Paul isn't a product of dynastic inbreeding. He's a break from it. And that, ironically, might have been the most responsible thing Catherine ever did for the gene pool. But Peter doesn't get to rule. In 1762, Catherine leads a coup, calm, bloodless, almost surgical. She seizes the throne, has Peter arrested, and shortly after he conveniently dies under mysterious circumstances. Catherine becomes Empress of Russia in her own right, reigning for 34 years, and while her political reforms, territorial expansion, and patronage of the arts earn her the title Great, she continues the royal marriage game with gusto, but now on her terms. She never remarries, but she takes a series of younger lovers, many of whom are nobles, military men, and, yes, sometimes cousins. She arranges marriages for her children and grandchildren with the same cold, strategic eye that brought her to power. Keeping it in the family isn't just a habit, it's a tactic. The idea is still alive and well: the tighter the bloodline, the tighter the grip on power. And while Catherine herself appears to be remarkably healthy, she lives to 67, active and engaged until the end, her descendants don't fare as well. Paul, whether or not he's Peter's biological son, becomes paranoid and erratic. His son, Alexander I, suffers from depression and possible dissociative episodes. His grandson, Nicholas I, begins exhibiting the same rigidity and mental fragility that would later be fully realised in Nicholas II. The Romanov line begins to show cracks: emotional, genetic and political. Here's your fringe fact of the night. Catherine once wrote that she had the constitution of a horse, boasting about her stamina and physical resilience. She would ride for hours, outwalk men half her age, and never catch cold. Some have argued this was partly true and partly propaganda. She needed to appear strong, virile, undiminished. After all, a woman ruling alone in a palace full of assassins couldn't afford to look weak. And here's the scholarly debate. Did Catherine's influence slow the decline of the Romanovs or hasten it? Some argue that her break with Peter and her possible sidestepping of inbreeding by choosing a non-royal lover helped refresh the bloodline. Others suggest she simply delayed the inevitable, reintroducing the same narrow gene pool through carefully arranged marriages in the next generation. Either way, the genetic echoes of her era would ripple straight into the 20th century, where haemophilia and fragile minds would finally break the dynasty entirely. Catherine dies in 1796, not dramatically, just suddenly, likely a stroke. She collapses alone in her chamber, and by morning, the woman who once conquered a continent is gone. Her body is embalmed and placed in the Peter and Paul Cathedral beside the very man she overthrew. It's a cruel joke, or maybe a royal tradition, burying enemies side by side so they can whisper through eternity. So you leave her there, sharp-eyed and shrewd, watching the empire she built begin to buckle under its own weight. She didn't escape the royal cycle of inbreeding, but she did outplay it, for a time. A German outsider who ruled Russia, who redefined what a woman could be, and who left behind not just a crown but a genetic puzzle that would torment her descendants for a century. The twilight of the empire smells like candle wax and mothballs. Faded portraits line the corridors, and every hall echoes like a mausoleum that hasn't yet admitted it's dead. You're in Austria again, but it's no longer the glittering age of Sisi or Maria Theresa. It's the early 20th century, and the empire is limping on broken ankles. And into this world walks Zita of Bourbon-Parma. Quiet, observant, last empress of Austria. Last empress of anything, really. Zita is born in 1892 into the House of Bourbon-Parma, a family tree that should come with a warning label. By this point, inbreeding isn't a trend, it's a commitment. Her parents are closely related cousins. Her father, Robert III, Duke of Parma, has children from 2 different marriages, both to women from the same Spanish Bourbon line. So in short, the DNA is circling the same drain. Zita is one of 24 children. That's not a dynasty, it's a small village. Her family speaks French at home, Italian at dinner, German in public, and Latin at Mass. Everyone is Catholic, everyone is noble, and no one questions why so many of the children have fragile health, delicate features, or peculiar personalities. That's just what happens when your family tree stops branching and starts folding. Zita is well educated, by royal standards at least. She's groomed for usefulness, not individuality. She learns music, religion, history, and, most importantly, how to marry well. Because that's what she's for, and in 9/11, she lands her most important role yet. She marries Archduke Charles of Austria, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. It's seen as a brilliant match, politically sound, genetically, well, no one's really asking those questions yet. And perhaps the saddest detail of all is that no one ever wrote her a proper obituary. The court wrote 3 sentences, something about her grace, her composure, her quiet faith. But no one said what everyone must have suspected, that she was another casualty of a system too proud to admit it was destroying its women. So you leave Carolina now, not draped in jewels, not mounted on a horse, but sitting quietly at her writing desk, her face turned slightly toward the window, her pen still moving, her spine still aching, a woman who tried to live well in a body she never got to build, with blood she never asked to carry. Her story might not be the loudest, but it's the most honest. Not every princess screamed. Some of them whispered, and some were so still, history almost forgot to write them down. Somewhere between the crumbling palaces of Germany and the polished salons of England, you find her, Princess Victoria Melita, a name that doesn't quite roll off the tongue, but one that carries the weight of 3 empires. Born in 1876 and nicknamed Ducky by her family, she's the granddaughter of Queen Victoria on her mother's side and a Romanov on her father's. If that already sounds like a Didawe cocktail shaken one too many times, you're not wrong. Victoria Melita enters the world with a bloodline that's pure royalty, and just as pure in its pitfalls. She grows up in Malta, then Coburg, then Darmstadt, constantly drifting between royal households like a pawn in someone else's game. Her parents are first cousins, of course, because why not double down on that Victorian-era belief that cousin love keeps the power close and the gene pool cleaner? Spoiler, it doesn't, not even close. In fact, by the time Victoria Melita is a teenager, her family tree has become a Mobius strip of shared ancestors and awkward family reunions. Still, she's spirited, rebellious. She rides horses like a cavalry officer, smokes cigarettes in secret, and rolls her eyes at the fussy rituals of court life. She's beautiful in that regal, angular way, dark hair, strong chin, eyes that look like they've seen too much already. And at 18, like clockwork, she's married off. To her cousin. Not just a cousin, but Ernest Lewis, Grand Duke of Hesse, the brother of the future Tsarina Alexandra of Russia. It's a marriage arranged by Queen Victoria herself, who believed matching cousins made for strong dynasties and compliant children. But Ducky wasn't having it. From the beginning, the marriage is tense. Ducky and Ernie share blood, but not much else. He's reserved, sensitive, rumoured to be gay, though that's still debated. She's restless, temperamental, and loathes the stuffy Hessian court. The only bright spot is their daughter, Elizabeth. But even that joy is short-lived. They begin sleeping in separate rooms. Arguments turn public, and within a few years, Ducky demands a divorce. Now here's the thing. Royal divorces were rare, scandalous, especially among Queen Victoria's descendants, who were expected to set examples, not headlines, but Ducky pushes through. The marriage is dissolved in 1901. Her daughter remains in Hesse with her father. The court tuts and gossips. Queen Victoria is reportedly livid, writing that no young woman has ever caused me such pain. The irony, of course, is that Victoria herself arranged the match in the first place, but Ducky isn't finished. In 1905, she marries again, this time for love, and surprise, it's another cousin. Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich of Russia, her first cousin through her mother's Romanov side. The Russian Orthodox Church isn't thrilled, because he marries her without the Tsar's permission. Nicholas II, their mutual cousin, is furious. Kirill's stripped of his titles, but eventually, after enough pressure and political manoeuvring, he's reinstated, and Ducky becomes Grand Duchess Victoria Fyodorovna. The couple settles into court life in Russia, but it's clear that Ducky doesn't quite fit. She's too bold, too opinionated, too British, really. The Russian aristocracy never fully accepts her, but she plays her role anyway, has more children, attends ceremonies, hosts glittering dinners, and watches the empire begin to disintegrate beneath their feet. By the time World War I hits, Russia is already unravelling. Ducky's sister-in-law, Tsarina Alexandra, is increasingly isolated and loathed by the people. Rasputin hovers like a shadow over the Romanov court. And Ducky? She watches from the sidelines, knowing full well how bad it's going to get. She and Kirill eventually flee during the revolution, narrowly avoiding the fate that claims so many of their relatives. Her niece, Grand Duchess Elizabeth, yes, the one we met earlier, is thrown into a mine shaft. Her cousin Nicholas II and his entire family are executed in a basement. Ducky loses most of her world in a matter of months. She resettles in exile, first in Finland, then in France. Kirill declares himself Emperor in Exile, a title with more desperation than legitimacy, and Ducky plays along. They publish manifestos, host dinners for other displaced Romanovs, pretend for a while that the empire might rise again, but it doesn't. Kirill dies in 1938. Ducky follows just 4 years later in 1936. Heart failure, brought on by years of stress, illness, and the kind of grief that settles in the bones. Now here's where it gets weird. Despite all the marriages, the moving, the royal chaos, no one really talks about Ducky's health. But there are clues. She suffers from fatigue, joint pain, and what her letters describe as strange dark days. Some believe she may have had lupus or an undiagnosed thyroid disorder. Others point to depression, common among the tightly wound descendants of Queen Victoria. But there's also the question of the bloodline. How much damage had already been baked into her chromosomes by generations of incestuous matchmaking? One of her daughters, Kira, would go on to marry into another inbred royal line, continuing the spiral. Another child died in infancy. It's a pattern by now. You've seen it. You know where it leads. Ducky didn't escape the curse. She just outran it for a little while. And here's your strange bedtime detail. She was buried wearing a small locket that contained a portrait of her first daughter, Elizabeth, who died at just 8 years old while living with her father. Ducky had never forgiven herself for leaving her behind. All her later glamour, the exile pomp, the letters to Empress Victoria couldn't cover that grief. So you leave her now, seated at a Paris salon piano, hair greying, eyes still sharp, woman who tried to rewrite the rules only to find the ink was already dry. She married for love, but the genes, the grief, the expectations, those came with her anyway. Just another royal woman trying to live her own life while dragging a dynasty behind her like a rusted anchor. By the time Kira Kirillovna Romanova is born in 1909, the idea of royalty is already beginning to rot around the edges. The palaces still stand, the titles still echo through drawing rooms, but behind the brocade curtains the illusion is crumbling. She is born into exile, baptized into a world that's technically majestic but practically powerless. Her parents, Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich of Russia and Victoria Melita of Edinburgh, are first cousins twice over. It's not a twist, it's a pattern. A decision made long before Kira existed, one that would shape every inch of her life. You know her mother, Ducky, by now, fiery, stubborn, exiled royalty. Her father, a Romanov who believed he still had a shot at the throne long after the revolution had turned the idea of Russian monarchy into ash. And so Kira is raised in the strange afterglow of an empire that no longer exists. There are no thrones, no coronations, no subjects, just titles whispered like bedtime stories and a deeply held belief that maybe, things will return to the way they were. From the outside, Kira has it all. She's beautiful, strikingly so. Tall, with dark features and eyes that seem both wise and wary. Her portraits from the 1920s show a girl poised like a painting, flawless posture, perfect hands. And that trained royal gaze that looks through you, not at you. But if you peer closer, the cracks are there. In her health, in her habits, in the quiet medical notes passed between family doctors. She suffers from frequent illness throughout childhood, chronic fatigue, mysterious infections, and episodes described vaguely in family letters as nervous spells. Nothing so dramatic as madness, but certainly not normal. Her mother blames nerves, her father blames stress, though the truth, if anyone had dared look hard enough, might have been in the family album. Kira descends from Queen Victoria on both sides, from the Habsburgs, from the Romanovs. Her blood is a cocktail of dynasties that have been marrying cousins since before indoor plumbing. The result? A body that looks like it was made for portraits but wilts under real pressure. Still, the family pushes on. In 938, Kira marries Louis Ferdinand of Prussia, head of the German Hohenzollern dynasty. That's right, another prince, another cousin, another closed loop in the royal DNA spiral. Their marriage is billed as a union of exiled empires, Russia and Germany, reuniting through love and duty, even as Europe teeters on the edge of another world war. The newspapers call it elegant, destiny, but behind the champagne and velvet gloves is a story as old as monarchy. Keep the bloodline pure no matter what the cost. Kira and Louis have 7 children, and yes, some of them thrive, but the shadows are still there. One child is born with a congenital heart defect. Another is described as delicate, with health so fragile he's mostly kept out of public view. Kira herself ages quickly. Chronic health problems begin to define her adult life. Her hands swell, her joints ache. There are whispers of lupus, thyroid dysfunction, even anemia so severe she occasionally faints during state functions. The official biographies call her stoic. You can almost hear the effort behind the word. She lives through World War II in a kind of suspended nobility, technically German but politically neutral, watching from the sidelines as the country burns itself down. After the war, she and Louis settle into a quiet ceremonial life in Germany. They host teas, attend weddings, appear in history books as footnotes to things that happened long after their families lost actual power. But Kira carries herself as if the empire is still alive. She wears her titles like armour. maintains court customs that haven't meant anything in decades. There's something both admirable and tragic in her resolve, like someone tending the gardens of a house that was demolished years ago. And yet beneath the surface the toll is undeniable. Her later years are marked by frequent illness, surgeries and long periods of seclusion. Her body, like so many royal women before her, just doesn't hold up. Whether it's the stress, the expectation, or the generations of folded over DNA, something wears down from within. Friends and relatives write about her in affectionate tones, dignified, reserved, resilient. But that word again, resilient, what it really means is she didn't complain while slowly falling apart. Kira dies in age 67 at just 57 years old. The cause of death is listed as complications from cancer, but the specifics are vague. What's more telling is how the funeral's handled. Military pomp, long-lost crowns dusted off for the occasion, hymns echoing through a church built for kings and queens who no longer reign. They bury her with full honours, as if the empire never ended. But it did. She just never admitted it. Here's your strange soft detail for the night. Kira reportedly kept a miniature icon of St. Olga, Russia's first Christian princess, at her bedside. She would touch it every morning before speaking to anyone, a ritual taught to her by her grandmother. It wasn't superstition, it was inheritance, a thread of meaning connecting her to 1,000 years of royalty, even if all she had left was the myth. And here's the question historians still can't answer, and Kira know. Did she understand that her children's health, her own decline, the early deaths scattered through her family line, did she know they were consequences of choices made generations ago? Or did she, like so many others, choose to believe it was all God's will? Divine testing, noble suffering. You leave her now standing in a black silk gown, posture perfect, eyes defiant. The last princess in a glass cage, surrounded by echoes and portraits of people who looked exactly like her, and paid the same quiet price. She didn't scream, she didn't rebel, but she never looked away either. And sometimes that's the most haunting kind of loyalty. By now, the stories are familiar, pale girls in heavy gowns, born to glitter and suffer. But when you meet Princess Alexandra of Hanover, something feels a little different. Not better, not healthier, just different. Born in 1882, Alexandra is one of those royals who isn't quite in the spotlight, but never far from it either. An accessory to dynastic alliances, a decorative figure placed where needed. You've probably never seen her name on a documentary title card, and yet her life is a perfect study in what happens when you stir together centuries of noble blood without letting in a drop of fresh air. Let's start with her parents. Alexandra is the daughter of Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland and Teviotdale, and Princess Thyra of Denmark. Both are royal, both come from families that have been enthusiastically into marrying for hundreds of years. Her father is the son of George V of Hanover, and her mother is the youngest daughter of King Christian IX of Denmark. That makes Alexandra a close cousin to pretty much every royal house in Europe. Britain, Germany, Russia, Denmark, Greece. Her DNA was drawn from the same handful of names shuffled again and again through political necessity and family pressure. The result? Well, on paper she's royalty squared. But biologically she's more like a copy of a copy of a copy, something slightly smudged. And while no one calls her sickly in the historical records, the details are telling. She has recurring respiratory issues from early childhood. She is described in letters as nervous and sensitive to light and sound, symptoms that would later be associated with sensory processing disorders or even neurodivergence. But of course, in a royal family, no one uses those terms. They call her delicate. They suggest she needs rest, fewer public appearances, more prayer. She grows up moving between Hanover and Gmunden, Austria, part of the family's exiled royal life after Hanover is annexed by Prussia. So she's technically a princess, but without a throne. There's wealth, sure, castles, jewels, servants, but it's all borrowed time. The political power is gone. What remains is the performance. Formal dinners, rehearsed small talk, constant awareness that your body and behaviour are not your own. By her teens, Alexandra is being positioned for marriage, because that's the only real path for someone like her. She has no independent role, no job, no inheritance. Her existence is a puzzle piece to be moved around the board. But there's a problem. Whispers about her health begin to circle. She faints during a church service, misses events due to mysterious fevers. One diplomat refers to her as constitutionally weak, which is code for not a good bet for producing heirs. Still, In 1904, she marries Frederick Francis IV, the Grand Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. It's not a love match. It's not even particularly strategic, more like a safe bet between two fading dynasties who need to preserve face. And yes, there are cousins, naturally. Their family trees overlap on multiple branches. The wedding is grand, but curiously subdued, as if everyone already knows this isn't going to end in fairy tales. At first, she tries to play the part. She smiles in portraits, attends state events, and even gives birth to 5 children. But behind the scenes, it's not quite so composed. She suffers from migraines so intense she is bedridden for days. Her pregnancies leave her physically wrecked, lasting complications, slow recovery, suspected postpartum depression. Her letters grow sparse and formal, her public appearances dwindle, and the court begins doing what it always does in these situations, covering, downplaying, pretending. Now here's where things get even more quietly tragic. One of her daughters, Cecilia, is engaged to Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, the son of the Crown Prince. It's a major match, a royal victory in a world already tilting towards a war. But during the planning stages, doctors raise concerns about family health history. There are hushed conversations about Alexandra's ailments, her chronic fatigue, her emotional withdrawal, her inability to recover fully after childbirth. The implication is clear. The Hanoverian blood might be tainted. That word again, tainted, so useful when you want to say something without saying it. Here's your unusual historical footnote. Alexandra was known to sleep in a silver-threaded nightgown, believing it would protect her from invisible ailments, a practice passed down through the Danish side of her family. The gown still exists, stored in a museum collection, laced with literal strands of metal, meant to ward off what they called ill humours. It's medieval superstition wrapped in luxury linen, and it tells you everything you need to know about the balance of medicine and magic in her world. When World War I erupts, Alexandra's life unravels like a tapestry left in the rain. Her husband's throne is abolished in 1918. The German monarchies fall like dominoes. The family flees their palace, stripped of titles, wealth, and identity. Alexandra, never strong to begin with, doesn't handle the transition well. Her health worsens. She develops what modern historians suspect was congestive heart failure, likely worsened by stress and years of physical strain. She dies into 63 in relative obscurity, aged 80. But those last decades, they're quiet, not peaceful, but muted. She rarely travels, rarely speaks publicly, becomes more of a family relic than a participant. Her surviving children scatter. Some marry, some fade into private life. But all of them carry traces of the same fragility, the same fading glow of borrowed royalty. The scholarly debate around Alexandra is subtle but persistent. Was she genuinely ill from birth, the result of a bloodline too folded in on itself? Or was she broken slowly by expectation marriage and repeated trauma? Historians divide on it. Some point to her childhood illnesses, others to her nervous disposition, still others to the possibility of untreated chronic illness exacerbated by pregnancies and loss. But the truth is probably both. Alexandra's body was born from 1,000 years of noble ambition, and in the end, it couldn't hold. She was a quiet casualty, not of violence or scandal, but of biology and boredom. No headlines, no uprisings, just another princess whose every cell carried a secret price. So leave her there now, on the balcony of a modest villa in Gmunden, wrapped in a shawl, staring at the lake with the same half-resigned gaze shared by all the other women in her lineage. She looks regal, poised, but the wind tugs at her sleeves and her hands tremble just slightly. Not enough for a scandal, just enough to remind you that inside every porcelain doll, there's a woman quietly coming undone. By now, the patterns are so familiar they almost lull you. Pale complexions, narrow jaws, hollow victories wrapped in lace. An inheritance. But in Spain, the pattern wasn't just a side effect, it was the system. And when you widen the lens to look at the women of the Spanish Habsburg line as a whole, it's less a family tree and more a genealogical horror story told in dimly lit cathedrals. This section isn't just one woman's tale, it's the chorus of them, echoing down stone hallways, each born into a cage they never saw being built. We've met some of them already. Maria Theresa, sent to France with hollow bones and royal expectations. Maria Anna, her jaw jutting forward like a genetic protest. Joanna the Mad spiralling into obsession and locked away for half her life. But tonight, we lay them side by side, an entire roster of royal daughters, sisters and wives sacrificed to keep power inside the family, no matter how many times it had to marry itself. The Spanish Habsburgs didn't just dabble in cousin marriages, they leaned all the way in. Of the 11 marriages between 1516 and 1700 in the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, 9 were between close relatives, uncle-niece, first cousins, even a double cousins, where both sets of grandparents were the same people. You think that's an exaggeration, but it's not, and the result was a generational experiment in genetic recycling that left its clearest scars not just on kings like Charles II, the famously inbred final Habsburg, but on the women whose names were footnoted, whose bodies bore the cost of it. Take Margaret of Austria, for example, not the Habsburg regent, but the Queen of Spain married to Philip III. Her portraits are haunting. She has that telltale jaw, the deep-set eyes, the heavy-lidded gaze. Her pregnancies were almost non-stop. 8 children in 13 years. She died from complications after the last one, her body too weak to recover. Her letters from the final years are brief and formal, dutiful, but one line repeats again and again, "If God wills it," as if he was the only one who could stop the machine grinding her down. Then there's Mariana of Austria, who was both the niece and the wife of Philip IV. Her Habsburg bloodline was so densely packed that her coefficient of inbreeding, yes, they calculate this, was equivalent to the child of a brother-sister pairing. She gave birth to 5 children, only one survived infancy. That one, Charles II, the poster child of dynastic collapse. But before Charles ever sat on a throne, Mariana was a young girl, married at age 14, tasked with saving a crumbling empire through childbirth alone. She never left the court. Her days were spent in prayer, protocol and physical deterioration. Contemporary observers noted her weak spirit and delicate mind, phrases that sound poetic until you remember they were talking about a teenager forced into marriage with her uncle. Maria Anna of Neuburg, brought in to marry the exhausted Charles II, was expected to produce an heir from a body that had long since given up. The two of them, both deeply inbred, failed spectacularly. They couldn't conceive, or if they did, it ended in miscarriage. Maria Anna was blamed, not Charles, whose jaw was so malformed he could barely chew, whose mental development stalled at adolescence, whose body was said to exude the smell of death. But no, Maria Anna was the failure. She became paranoid, isolated, convinced she was cursed. And maybe, in a way, she was. The irony is that these women were often intelligent, well-read, politically aware. Isabella Clara Eugenia, daughter of Philip II, co-ruled the Spanish Netherlands with real skill. Maria Christina of Austria, centuries later, would act as regent and modernizer, but no matter how sharp they were, their futures were always determined by blood and by whom they could bear. Now here's your fringe fact for the night. The Habsburgs kept extensive marriage records, and some of the planning was done with literal, hand-drawn bloodline diagrams, proto-charts that showed how closely related 2 potential spouses were, not to avoid danger, but to ensure purity. It was less about health and more about keeping power hermetically sealed. To them, too much genetic overlap was a feature, not a bug. Of course, the scholarly debate rages on. How much of this was conscious? Did they know they were breeding frailty into the line? Some say yes, that warnings were ignored, that early medical signs were brushed aside in favour of political continuity. Others argue it was simply the logic of the time. Royal blood had to be kept pure, and purity in their minds meant repetition, not diversity. Marrying outsiders was risky. Outsiders had ideas, cousins did not. And so the women suffered. Miscarriage after miscarriage, stillbirths. Children who lived just long enough to smile once and die in the cradle, and the ones who survived. Many bore the subtle marks. Stiff joints, soft bones, weak immune systems, jaws so misaligned they couldn't close their mouths without effort. But the pressure never stopped. Each Habsburg woman was told the same thing. Your body is your legacy. Produce sons, maintain the bloodline, don't complain. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all, that they knew, on some level, what was happening. and still they submitted. Faith, fear, or force, it doesn't really matter. The outcome was the same. So tonight, you don't just see one woman, you see dozens, sitting under heavy veils, kneeling in bone-chilling chapels, holding infants already marked by fate. Their stories are fragmented, lost in the margins of their husbands' reigns, but they form a chain, a loop, the very loop that would end the Spanish Habsburg dynasty entirely by 1700, when Charles II died childless, the last of his kind. And as the candles flicker out in the Escorial monastery, where many of them lie entombed, you can almost imagine them whispering not prayers, not regrets, but warnings. Warnings no one listened to. And now we reach the end of the bloodline, or at least the part that's still gilded in oil paintings and dusted with incense. But if you think the story of inbred royalty is just a thing of the past, something sealed inside the tombs of Vienna, Madrid, or St. Petersburg, you might want to lean in a little closer. Because those marriages, those whispered family decisions made behind cathedral doors, their consequences didn't stay in the 16th or 17th centuries, they echo forward into the bodies, the blood, and even the politics of people still alive today. The legacy of these women isn't just romantic tragedy or faded portraits in museum corners, it's genealogical truth. And while the overt cousin marrying stopped mostly by the early 20th century, the damage was already done. Generations of tightly looped genetics don't unravel overnight. And so we begin to see the aftershocks, in strange places, in unexpected faces. Let's start with haemophilia, the royal disease. Introduced into the bloodstream of Europe by Queen Victoria, a carrier of the genetic mutation, it slipped silently into her descendants, affecting royal boys from England to Germany, to Spain to Russia. Her son Leopold died from it. Her great-grandson, Alexei Romanov, the fragile heir of Nicholas and Alexandra, bled to death metaphorically and literally, his illness a destabilizing force in a crumbling empire. Even into the 20th century, distant royal relatives carried the mutation. In some modern cases, descendants, long since stripped of thrones, found themselves in hospital wards, unaware that their bleeding disorders traced it back to centuries of dynastic vanity. And it's not just haemophilia. Geneticists have studied the Spanish Habsburg line extensively, especially the infamous Charles II, whose coefficient of inbreeding, 0.25, is equivalent to the child of a brother and sister. His severe physical and cognitive issues weren't anomalies, they were the endpoint of a system obsessed with bloodline purity. And that system didn't just produce one broken king, it produced generation after generation of women who suffered quietly, while those around them maintained the myth of divine right. Take a modern example. Descendants of European royalty today still carry the legacies of these unions. While cousin marriage among royals is no longer fashionable, or wise, the lineages are so deeply intertwined that many aristocratic families can't avoid a shared family tree. Geneticists analysing mitochondrial DNA and inherited disorders in European noble lines have noted concentrations of rare diseases, autoimmune conditions and chronic illness patterns that align chillingly with historical accounts. Of course, modern medicine mitigates many of these risks. No one's relying on leeches or holy relics anymore, at least we hope. Genetic screening exists, but you can't screen out 1,000 years of calculated incest overnight. And so the conversations persist, quiet, awkward ones behind closed doors, about whether certain names and certain bloodlines come with more baggage than benefit. Here's your unsettling bedtime detail. Some living royals today are known to have certain facial traits historically associated with inbred ancestors. Long upper lips, narrow palates, prominent chins. We don't talk about it because it feels taboo, even cruel, but science isn't interested in politeness. And the faces we still see on royal Christmas cards or state occasions, they carry echoes, remnants. The scholarly debate continues too. Historians and medical experts argue over how much of this is coincidence, how much is confirmation bias, and how much is just the uncomfortable truth. Are we too quick to blame inbreeding for every frail royal? Or have we still not fully reckoned with the fact that Europe's most powerful families spent centuries playing genetic Russian roulette for the sake of political stability? And what about the psychological toll? These women, Margaret, Maria Theresa, Zita, Alexandra, they weren't just physically suffering. They were trapped in institutions that gaslit their pain, romanticised their sickness and rewarded them for hiding their illnesses. Their stories are a masterclass in weaponised politeness. in how empires can die not with revolutions, but with one more stillbirth, one more fainting spell, one more woman folded too tightly into a corset to breathe. Even today, royal families walk a tightrope between tradition and change. The British royal family, for example, began marrying outside of aristocracy only recently. Meghan Markle's entrance into the House of Windsor marked one of the few times someone with absolutely zero royal blood married in, and the backlash was as swift as it was telling. The idea of outsider blood still stirs something primal in royal institutions, even if they pretend it doesn't. The system might have evolved, but the DNA of monarchy, its obsession with legacy, image and control, remains stubbornly intact. Which brings us to the final irony. The very blood these dynasties tried so hard to protect became the thing that ruined them. They married their cousins to protect the throne, and the throne collapsed. They preserved their purity, and in doing so ensured their extinction. Spain, France, Austria, Russia, all brought to their knees not just by war or revolution, but by an internal rot too quiet to notice until it was irreversible. And yet, even now, the myth persists. We still romanticize royalty. Netflix makes miniseries. Tourists flock to castles. We adore the fairy tale. But for the women who lived it, the ones whose bones still lie in crypts beneath cathedrals, it was less a dream than a long, soft horror. One where the walls were silk-lined, but the doors were locked from the outside. So as the final candle flickers out on this long line of royal women, women bred for power, trapped by tradition, and broken by biology, remember this. They didn't choose it. The gowns, the marriages, the bloodlines, that was never theirs to question. But their stories, those are ours to remember. And maybe that's how we break the spell. So here we are, lying back in the dark after 30 tales of silk and sorrow, of dynastic ghosts and bloodlines folded in on themselves like origami. If you've made it this far, still awake, still with me, then maybe you've realised something unsettling. The fairy tale was never real. Or if it was, it came with a price no one told you about. The castles had cold walls, the crowns had weight. And the princesses? They were never rescued. They were bred. That's the real bedtime story no one reads aloud. Across empires and centuries, these women weren't just born into royalty. They were born into systems that measured their worth by the children they could carry, the diseases they could hide, and the marriages they didn't get to refuse. And those systems were so obsessed with preserving their own power that they didn't mind sacrificing a few daughters, or entire generations of them, to keep the blood pure. Purity, in this case, was just another word for stagnation, for rot in a velvet glove. You might be wondering what the point of all this was. Why spend hours tracing jawlines and family trees and hearing about fainting spells in candlelit rooms? Because buried beneath the royal titles and genetic jargon are real women, forgotten names, half-seen portraits, human beings who carried centuries of ambition in their bones and often broke under it. Their suffering wasn't loud, it wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, polished. The kind of pain you couldn't mention in court without risking a scandal. And that, more than anything, is what made it so insidious. Maybe there's a lesson here, not just about monarchy, but about how institutions protect themselves at the cost of individuals. How beauty and legacy and nobility are often just smokescreens for control, and how progress, when it finally arrives, is often too late for the ones who needed it most. So if you're still but with me, blanket pulled high, fan humming light low, let's take one last breath together. Not a royal one, a real one. History remembers the crowns, we remember the women underneath them.